Said it doesn't matter who's right or wrong. I don't want. So we've been there 2 or 3 times, yeah.
Very helpful. I think I copied it, captured it all, but, you know, buyer beware is all I'll say.
Oh, thank you for trying.
Did you get the mayor your version or?
No,
Oh,
he can. Wait, this seems way too thin.
I
Double-sided?
Yeah, this
Okay.
was double-sided.
Okay.
Welcome. And you have yours.
Must be vacation season.
Oh, okay, that's the only one, okay.
Oh, well,
314 and
yeah,
319 version.
that is true. I have heard that from many a person as well. It's not in agreement.
You should have had this.
Welcome, Counselor.
319 for this. And I just highlighted, that's all it is, took these and these and highlighted this, and copied it. Final version.
Okay, good, thank you.
Are you gonna talk about Baumgartner's beach proposal?
It's at your bailiwick.
Well, 1 o'clock, I'd like to call the April Fool's Day Town Council meeting to order. May I ask everybody to please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Of the United States of America.
Madam Clerk, the roll, please.
Mayor Bell?
Here.
Turner?
Here.
Mr. Farrell?
Here.
Ms. Kay?
Here.
Mr. Spencer?
Here.
Ms. Tillerson? Here.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. The first agenda item is the approval of the minutes of the special call town council meeting. And in fact, let's take all those 3 collectively, the minutes of the special call February 18th meeting, the minutes of the March 4th town council meeting, and the minutes of the March 17th town council meeting. Those minutes have been provided in advance to council members. Do you have any changes or corrections?
I do not.
None.
The minutes
job, Petra.
for each of those 3 meetings are approved. The next agenda item is citizen comments, and this is on agenda items only. Citizen comments? No citizen comments. Updates. I will begin. A few matters. First, for those of you who are watching online live or will be watching video afterwards, I hope that you will note a change in both the camera angles, the quality of the video, and the quality of the audio. We've implemented our new audiovisual system. He's hiding behind a desk over there, but I want to give a particular shout out to Neil Kynard, who has been the person who's been responsible for making sure that all comes together. So hopefully, Neil, I don't know if you can hear me or not, but no hiccups today. But hopefully everybody will be able to enjoy the upgraded capabilities when they watch this online. A few other matters that have recently arisen, and the community is generally aware of a couple of these. As everyone I think now knows, subsequent to the mediated settlement agreement pertaining to the lawsuits that the developer had brought against the town with regard to matters pertaining to Cape Point Road Extension, Ocean Pines, and West End and the Cape Club, there was some agreement that the town would issue a temporary certificate of occupancy for commencing operations at the Cape Club. That was contingent upon three things to be completed by the developer. One was completion of the cul-de-sac at the end of Southern Pines Lane. The second was approval by the KICA board of an amendment to the MOU between the partners and KICA. And the third was submission of operational or interim parking plan. Those three conditions were met, and as a result, a week or two ago, the town did issue a temporary certificate of occupancy for the Cape Club to commence operations, which I think they've announced publicly they're intending to do within the next week or two. At our last special call meeting, we noted that with regard to another pending legal matter, which was the lawsuit initiated by the town, the Kiowa Conservancy, and the Community Association against the property owner of Captain Sam Spit, that we had agreed to enter into a mediation process. We had a full day of mediation last Friday. There's not much I can report. Mediation proceedings are confidential unless and until there's any final agreement. The only thing I can say is that, and Councilmember Kay joined me at this mediation, so if she may have her own perspectives on this, that it was a lengthy but very constructive set of conversations involving not only the three parties who initiated the lawsuit and the partners, but different state entities and representatives as well. What I can also say is the town administration, I believe this reflects the view of each council member as well, remains first and foremost committed to ensuring that Captain Sam Spit is preserved and protected. We want to be able to preserve public access to Beachwalker County Park and the beaches along Captain Sam Spit, but also protect the highlands, which is critical habitat for our beloved bobcats, as well as a range of state endangered or federally endangered nesting and migratory shorebirds. Another update that's been a long time coming, people have asked a number of questions about what's happening at Andel West. The developer of that project recently reached out to the town about their desire to put in a roundabout on Kiowa Island Parkway at the first entrance as you're coming onto the island into that Andel West property that would link into the planned development. In having that conversation, we asked to get an update on the process for the development of the Andel West project, which I think everybody is aware is not within the town's jurisdiction. It's within the county's jurisdiction. And whether, in fact, the plans that were proceeding were consistent with the agreement that had been really hammered out over a period of weeks or even months between community representatives and the developer. This goes back about 2 years ago. We're still trying to get some additional information, but suffice it to say that there were some questions as to whether the plans that they're moving forward on now are consistent in all material respects with what was agreed with the community. Hasn't been any resolution of those issues. A couple things just to note in the latest iteration of their plans. What they had indicated is the hope was to have a new Harris Teeter finished and occupied in 2029, so another 4 years from now. But in the first phase, there would only be the Harris Teeter, the gas station, and some retail. As many people will recall, one of the key elements of the plan that was agreed with the community back 2 years ago was the first phase would include a new village green as well as what was characterized as Restaurant Row. That does not appear to be their intention right now. In their current plans, it looks like they plan to move the fuel station, the fuel center, from the beginning of the property all the way back adjacent to the Harris Teeter which would make it more like a lot of their other Harris Teeter properties around the area. So to be continued. We're still going to have some back and forth with the developer about that, and no decisions have been made as to whether the town would agree at this point in time to work with a developer on installing a roundabout at that location. Several other things we'll comment on later part of the agenda. I do want to note that we continue as a town administration, as a council, to systematically work through a wide range of policies and procedures. Many of those have been more internally focused, accounting policies and procedures. We more recently adopted a new HR handbook and HR policies and procedures, a standard form of municipal contract, standard form of RFP. We are today going to be considering a second considering second reading of an entirely new procurement ordinance. And some code enforcement policies. Upcoming is going to be a complete, and maybe Councilmember Kay want to talk about this, a complete rewrite of the Beachfront Management Act. We're also undertaking a number of zoning code changes. So that process will continue. With that, I will turn it over to Councilmember Berner.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I had a very busy month. As always, I try to focus mostly on issues that make Kiowa a better and a safer place to live. So 6 things happened during that I was working on. March 14 and 15, as you know, I am the leader and the organizer of the Community Emergency Response Team. On the 14th and 15th, my team had 2 days of training along with Johns Island, Seabrook, and James Island, where we were trained in life-saving skills, extricating trapped individuals, triage of cataclysmic events like a tornado, earthquake, hurricane, whatever. Our group here in Kiowa is unusually strong, and we were complimented, or I was complimented specifically by the trainers that included EMT in Charleston County, the fire department, the police department, of how energetic and excited and how much the Kiowa CERT team is involved, which apparently, as I'm learning, is unusual in this area. So anyway, we did good training. We have more training to come through, but we're doing what we can to get ready if a cataclysmic event occurs. Number 2, I worked on a very rough and rudimentary first pass. It's not even a draft, I wouldn't even call it, for the potential design build contract on an entertainment facility. Spent a lot of time researching contracts for other organizations that were used for this, and I will be discussing this further with attorneys in our committee to further refine it and revise it. I am the chairman of the safety committee. This is number 3, we had a really robust discussion about Sandy Point, just like we did here on town council at the last meeting. At the end of the day, Captain Eubanks, who was in charge of this immediate area here, agreed that he would communicate with the Charleston Police Marine Unit to periodically patrol or do a drive-by, as he called it, the area outside of Sandy Point, to just to show a presence, not really to police per se, is just to let the people who are at Sandy Point know that there are eyes on them. So that's really good. Something else we discussed was what to do if the Kiowa Island Bridge is lost, hurricane, tornado, whatever it may be. So we have a committee right now that is formed that is working on an action plan for the immediate 2 days or 3 days or 1 week after such event, what to do. Now we have a contract to replace the bridge, that's the easy part. But what about those 3, 4, or 5 days between when the bridge is lost and the replacement bridge comes in? So we're working on an action plan to do that. Number 4, I met with the Kiowa Island Utilities to find out what the current excess capacity is of their sewage plant. Currently, the design is for 5,600 ERUs, which stands for equivalent residential units, and the current flows are at 4,000. So we're halfway there, so we know what the design capacity is and what the usage is, but we don't yet know what it includes. Does it include the expansion of the sanctuary? Yes or no, I do not know. Does it include Upper Beach Walker? Does it include West Beach the new hotel? Don't know. I'm passing that baton on to Lance, who's going to further try to drill down on that. But we're partway there. We know what the excess capacity is, but we don't know if it's covering everything that's remaining to be built out on the island. Number 5, I received an email from a resident on the island here for trash that just keeps being piled up by a non-performing contractor. The reason why I'm bringing it up is because the community member was thankful, but also apologetic in saying that they were sorry that they were contacting me on the weekend. And the reason I'm bringing it up, I want you guys to know it doesn't matter to me if it's a Saturday or Sunday or whatever day of the week. If you have an issue, contact me. I will do whatever I can at that particular moment to try to fix what is going on. Lastly, I was very, very fortunate to be the representative of the town at the steel topping off ceremony for the MUSC building, that's emergency room that's going to be down the road here. It was a lot of fun, pretty exciting. Got to sign the beam, which was really cool. But one thing I wanted to let you know, or two things actually, they are on schedule for opening the end of this year, which is really, really good news. The other thing I wanted to let you all know is that they're going to have a helipad there, which also is really, really good news. So we're getting really close to having an emergency hospital here, very close to our community. That's it, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councilmember Berner. Councilmember Kay.
Okay, a couple of things. First off, the mayor mentioned the mediation on Friday, and I don't have anything substance to add because I can't. But I just want the community to know that the various environmental, because what I have to say is really important. Okay, how's this? Okay, so the various environmental, ecological constituencies were well spoken for. All the hundreds of shorebird stewards and the Turtle Patrol and the Bobcat Guardians. So we made all sides very aware of the deep commitment that this community has got to preserving all wildlife as well as the shoreline and the beach. So it was very interesting to be part of that, and I appreciate it. As far as the beach management ordinance that the mayor referenced, there was a subgroup of Pam Wilson, Cindy Perry, Jim Jordan, and myself who tackled probably about the 4th phase in the redraft of this ordinance. We had farmed it out in parcels to various members of the Environmental Committee, and it just kept coming back as a bit of a hodgepodge, pretty inconsistent. And so we were charged with taking a look at that ordinance from start to finish and redrafting it in its entirety. And it took quite a bit of time and a lot of focus and attention, but I think we produced a product that was considerably better than what we had produced to date. That draft is going to come before council sometime in the next couple of months. I guess it's with you now for review. And so who knows what additional work needs to be done on it. But this subcommittee really was really dedicated and devoted. And for those people who have been wondering about the dog leash issue and if that has dropped off the radar completely, it has not. It is included in this draft of this ordinance, so at some point we will be dealing with it. But I know we're all really looking forward to that. And then finally, Earth Day, we've got that coming up in April. Again, I want to thank a variety of people who have contributed to some upcoming publicity on this. First, Shai has been hard at work producing materials and getting everything needed for the Earth Day celebration. And then we decided that it would be a good idea to do a podcast that would publicize the various elements of our fun and games. And Petrea, I want to thank you for taking over that job. And in my absence, I really appreciate it. We had folks working on that, and the focus of Earth Day for us as a town is going to be Bobcats and getting additional signatures on the Bobcat Pledge. So we had Petrea and Pam Wilson and Cindy Perry and Shai. And then Neil, I'm adding my thank you to the mayors, because literally the drop of a hat, within 24 hours, we put together what I am hoping is going to be one of the more fun and creative podcasts that we've done so far. So I keep an eye out on that. I'm hoping maybe it'll drop by the end of this week. And anybody from the town that wants to attend, I think the council members, I hope you'll be able to join me. It really should be a lot of fun. And that's it for me.
Councilmember Farrell.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Three things to talk about. Since our last meeting, we have stood up our new accommodation tax committee. This is the committee that works on allocating about $3.5 million or so that come from different accommodations from the state, the county, and local accommodations. I say new committee, it's really the 6 existing members and 1 new member who both is a business owner at Freshfields and is a resident in Kiowa. We reviewed kind of the changes from last year. We reviewed our charter, and we continued our discussion about philosophically how should we allocate the monies that come in from the state, the county, and the local to continue to generate tourism. What's our policy? How do we think about the entities that should get these monies to generate and promote tourism? Second thing, along the same lines, we stood up our audit committee. Again, this was a new committee, not a new committee, but stood up with all new members this time. The fortunate part of this was, even though they're all new members, one of them was one of the original members that created the audit committee back in about 2014. So we reviewed the budget. We outlined the financial audit and getting the financial auditors in here, I think next week, Dorada, to meet with us. And then we also outlined new goals for the audit committee that go beyond just the financial audits, which is clearly the most important thing for the town, the financial audit, but go into other things around policies and procedures where we have goals and objectives that need to be audited as well. So standing up an approach to auditing the other things that the town is supposed to be doing. Last but not least, and this should interest Ms. Kay especially, I had the great fortune to be part of the team that monitored the bird capture yesterday. I shouldn't use bird capture, but the bird banding on Captain Sam Spit. You know, this is red knot season, and so we had representatives from the state of South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, Georgia Natural Resources, Seabrook, and Kiowa Wildlife Departments, as well as the shorebird stewards from Seabrook and Kiowa. And they were able to capture somewhere between 80 and 100 birds, ban those birds so we can continue our research about the migration of the birds, where they go. And if you haven't seen it, there's a great email that just came out this morning, I believe, that talks about the migration patterns, and it has a great graphic showing where red knots come from and where they go based on these tracking devices and bandings that these folks put on the birds. It was a very exciting session, I'll say. I was at the 6 a.m. session, so there were only 2 people walking that we had to ask to just stay back because of the danger of the netting process. But it was really, really very educational and encouraging to see what Kiowa and Seabrook do to kind of protect their wildlife and preserve what's quickly growing to be an endangered species. So very fun morning yesterday morning. That's all for me, Mr. Mayor.
I'm just going to add, I think CBS Sunday Morning yesterday, was yesterday Sunday? No,
yesterday.
on Sunday morning, did a piece on DeVos and the shorebirds there. So getting some publicity.
Councilmember Spencer.
Just a couple things. Had the first meeting of the Infrastructure and Public Works Committee last month. Laid out kind of our game plan for the year, priorities, actions, initiatives. One of the things that we're going to do is invite the various utilities and service providers to come, kind of like Russ was alluding to give us a better insight, hopefully, as to capacity, resiliency, plans for the future, investments they may be making to make sure infrastructure is available to support us going forward. So more on that. The next meeting of the committee will be this Thursday, 10 to 12. And because of how the dates fall, the first Monday in May is May 1st before the next council meeting. So we'll have 2 meetings before the next council meeting, which works out nice. We'll continue to get some things done. I think the only other really big thing is, well, 2 big things. One is last week, both staff and various Public Works Committee members and others met with Crown Castle, the tower provider for several of the towers on Kiowa, and T-Mobile, Verizon, and AT&T to discuss cell coverage initiatives. They gave us some recommendations and requests that they'd like us to consider to make it easier for them to get the coverage that we need, both for quality of life as well as the public safety considerations, because a lot of public safety is now done over cellular. Joanne Hennessy from the Planning Commission, who's the chair of the Planning Commission, has been part of these also. She, John Taylor, and I are talking about what the next steps will be on moving forward with that. You know, we get a lot of feedback. It's just like everything, you know, a lot of feedback and then no feedback, but we get pretty consistent feedback about cell coverage for all 3 carriers, whether it be in-home coverage, whether it be drop calls. But I think sometimes one part that's missed is cellular broadband, which is what 5G is, and then the future Gs are going to be. And a lot of what people do on their devices, or if they want to have an alternative in their home for internet and Wi-Fi provided over cellular versus fiber, you know, there are ways to take care of that, but we need to figure out what's best for the community and then what actions are appropriate to take going forward to help incentivize these builds. Crown Castle is going to work on a proposal to submit to the town, working with the carriers on what they would like to do to increase coverage. So more to come on that. The final thing, the alibi, the town did cut over most of the staff and I think all of council onto FirstNet last week, which is a nationwide public safety broadband network, which is used by the vast majority of first responders in the country, including Charleston County and FEMA and others. So that'll help us with assured communications in emergencies and other events, as well as being on the same platform for some things that happen as we would interact in different scenarios with for other first responding agencies and community members. So that's a great step forward as well for the town to be able to operate through a disaster or a natural event or something like that.
Thank you, Councilmember Spencer, our town administrator.
Yes, I just have a few updates as well. One, I want to update everyone on the leisure trail, which I think that is something that you guys will be interested in learning more about, and also you all have been working, of course, to approve proper pavers to do the work. So Brian, our Public Works Director, right now we have the contract's in the hands of the mayor, but once that is signed, they are ready to execute. Again, this should be only about 10 to 15 days total, hopefully minimal impact. I probably should have Brian come up here if you want to have any other questions, but essentially, as you guys are aware, there was some conversation about maybe expanding the scope a little bit. We had to talk to the county first to make sure they were okay with that. It's my understanding that they are. It's still within the cost that they approved. Also, I'm going to let Brian maybe talk more about it. If there's anything that I've left out that you want to talk about in regards to if there's going to be flaggers, so if pedestrians are using the bike path, how they'll be able to essentially
Yes, ma'am.
bike on that.
Yes, ma'am. You pretty much covered all of it. Again, we are just making sure that all of our ducks are in a row with the contract. We'll send that over to them, and they'll be able to get started. We are looking maybe about a week's time of doing the project. And again, these areas are going to cover one portion of Beachwalker Drive from Bobcat Lane and down to the intersection. And then the other portion that was part of the original scope was the area in front of, well, pretty much between Old Cedar Lane at Cacique down to the end of the bike path at Freshfields. But we are going to be adding an additional scope area that's right before the bridge on the inbound side. We've noticed that area does hold water, and there's flooding and water retention after a good rain there. So we have added that to the scope of this project as well. It's pretty much just a change order. We're still going to be able to have that covered under the funds that we were given from the county. So it's not a grand impact on the town, but just does extend the scope a little bit. So we'll be taking care of that. And then, yeah, the design and traffic control plan will be coming to us, and we'll review that and make sure that everyone's good with it. And that obviously safety is key in every project that we do. So we'll make sure that everyone is on board with a good, safe plan to put PEDs and bikes around the project area.
And we'll make sure, too, that we push out the information in our Friday e-blast, just to let residents know to be aware, be mindful that there may be some delays as they're biking or walking along the pathway, or any public safety program or that we have. We'll also push that out as well in the e-blast on Friday.
Yeah, we will be certainly working close to the communications department, put out updates and awareness to the project.
And I would just note that the scope of the change order, incorporating that new area, the curve closer to the bridge, amounts about 10 or 11,000 additional. So
yes,
well within the 30,000 scope of change order authority that I had pursuant to this contract. In any event, as you noted, that all of this will be picked up by the county grant.
Yes, sir.
Correct. Thank you.
Thank you.
The only other two updates that I have is just to let you all know, if you recall, we were doing a RFQ for on-call engineering service that is pushed out. So if any of you guys know of any firms that you would like for us to reach out, or you can let them know to go to our website, they can find that on the website along with the dates to get that into us. The request for proposal for landscape, of course, that's still out, and that is due back, I believe, on April 11th. So there will be a committee pulled together, and they will work on that as well. And then last, of course, but very important, is the Kiowa Next.
I'm not picking it up with clarity.
Oh, you're not?
Are you guys?
You're getting a little bit of an echo.
Yeah, it's just not clear.
It's not clear? Yeah. How about, I'll just stand back.
Maybe
and
that would be
yeah,
better.
maybe that
It's
would
okay.
help.
Actually, it's odd. It's okay on this side of the room. Yeah, it's odd. It's.
I think it's reverberation.
Oh, I'll just stay. Can you hear
That's
me
better.
better?
That's
Okay.
better.
On April 2nd, tomorrow, the Planning Commission is going to discuss the Kiowa Next. So that is back on track. What they're looking to do is they have a very aggressive schedule where they would like to, they're going to assign different sections to each commissioner. The goal is to be able to have the planning commissioners make a recommendation at their ultimately come to council in July, but of course, we'll reiterate to them that they need an extra month or two. I think that's fine. I don't think there's a comprehensive police out there, but because we want to make sure that they feel very comfortable. They want to make some edits to it, which I think will improve the plan. They want to, I think, make it more actionable. They want an implementation plan, and they're going to, I think, center around some kind of key themes. But again, they're going to first have a discussion tomorrow, make sure they're all on the same playing field in regards to kind of the look and feel and idea of the Kiowa Next comprehensive plan, and then from there, they'll have a work session. And then any changes that they make from staff standpoint, we'll make the edits for them, and hopefully it'll be ready for the June meeting, but we'll see. If no questions, I know Caroline has some exciting news that she would like to let everyone know about.
Just before Caroline starts, Caroline joined us how long ago now? I mean, how many?
It's been about 3 months.
About 3 months. Came on in a slightly expanded role from her predecessor as the Arts and Cultural Events Program Manager. Heretofore, that position had been almost solely focused on the Arts Council programming. And Caroline's mandate is to not only execute that to a fairly well, but to also look for opportunities for other arts and cultural events that would be of interest to the residents and visitors to Kiowa. And I would also note that what she's going to talk about, she's also worked on, has worked on as Shai Graham, who is another member of our Communications and Public Affairs Department, and they've collaborated on what I agree is, I hope, is be of interest to the community.
Yeah, so a little community announcement. Starting in April through August, once a month, we'll be transforming the green space out here outside of Town Hall into a food truck festival. We're calling it Food Truck Fridays. So we'll have 5 to 6 vendors at the minimum, one Friday a month. I'll give you the dates at the end here. And we'll have some live entertainment as well, just as a community gathering event that's fun and food focused, kind of give you some other options besides what's in Freshfields, right, or at the clubs. We'll have some bluegrass bands. At the first one is kind of a summer kickoff, and then at the last one, a summer send-off with another band. Those dates will be April 18th, May 16th, June 6th, July 18th, and August 15th. And I put some flyers right out here outside the doors that you could grab on your way out. And we just really appreciate if you could spread the word and come out and see us on those days and just have a good time. It's be 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. You grab your lunch here and hang out, listen to music, play some yard games, and enjoy the sun.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you. Old business. First item of old business is to consider approval of ordinance 2025-03. This is our new encroachment permitting ordinance, and this is for second and final reading, and this is under tab 4. I would note that, and hopefully everybody's gotten updated materials, that the copy that was included in the book initially did not, in fact, reflect the changes that were made to incorporate comments that were made by council members at the last council meeting, where we improved this on first reading. So I would particularly direct your attention to, and this was raised by Councilmember Byrne at the time, under, which I'm not sure which version you have in front of you, but under permit applications, there is in the, what we originally considered and was in our current materials is D, a site plan identifying the proposed project's layouts, blah, 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 blah. There was supposed to have been added a new subsection E, which reflects the discussion at the last council meeting when we approved this on first reading, and that new subsection E is documentation of existing site conditions, including photographs and a tree survey of the affected right-of-way, and there was a new added sentence there under a permit application fee as set by resolution of the town council from time to time shall be required by the application. Those were the changes that were made that are being now considered on second reading, the changes from what was approved on first reading. I would entertain a motion for approval of the ordinance on second reading.
So moved.
Second.
Any further discussion?
I only have a clarification. It's not really a comment. I just want to make sure we understand what we're going to be getting or requesting. Under permit requirements, it says a permit is required within or outside the corporate limits, and when there's a project inside or outside the corporate limits of the town. Of course, I don't have any problem with that. But then you go down to the permit application, it talks about a traffic impact analysis is required. So I'm okay with this, but I just wanted to make sure we all are on the same page. So if and when the West Beach Hotel is going to be constructed, this encroachment permit would require a traffic impact analysis?
Well, a couple things. One, where does it say a traffic impact analysis is required?
First page, 3A.
Those are information that the public director is authorized to require. They are not necessarily required with the permit application. That's point. Just
Well,
point.
I understand, but that, my question then still goes back to, for things that are inside the gate.
So that would not be an encroachment, that would not involve an encroachment on.
Well, that's why I started this off saying a permit is required for any project, whether it's inside or outside the corporate limits. So that would include then the
West Beach would be in
Hotel.
corporate limits, but that would not be a project that would be accessing or encroaching upon.
Well, you have to get, so you and I have talked about this. So if you have to use the Kiowa Island Parkway to get to your job site, you're accessing the parkway.
John Taylor's not here, he might be able to say, council might be able to ask this, but that's not generally what's considered to be an encroachment.
I understand that. I
So,
understand.
I mean, otherwise, we would be requiring a permit for any work, anywhere on Kiowa Island at any time.
That's why I was bringing it up.
So,
That's why I
yeah,
started the
okay.
whole conversation off saying, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So what this is meaning then, listening to what you're saying, is that using the West Beach Hotel as an example, they would not require an encroachment permit.
They would require a encroachment permit from Kika,
Yes,
but
yes.
not from the town, yeah.
I got it.
Yes.
I started off saying, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. And so so they would not require a permit from us. And I'm okay with that. I just wanted to get that clarification out
Fair
there.
enough.
Okay.
Mr. Berner, does it help if you look at Exhibit A under definitions, number A, right-of-way shall mean publicly owned or controlled land? So maybe inside the first gate is private. You think that solves the problem for us?
No, I'm okay with the way it is. I just wanted to make sure that we were not going to be asking for an encroachment permit because whether it's inside or outside the corporate limits, again, using the West Beach Hotel as an example.
You would still have to meet one of the conditions, A, B, C, D, or E.
I understand.
Yeah,
No,
okay.
I just
Yeah,
said
okay. Fair
three
enough.
times. I'm okay with this. I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page of when we would want a permit. That's all I was trying to conclude.
Okay.
Mayor, could you please just clarify what the motion was again?
Motion was to approve the ordinance on second reading.
Okay, did you, as we discussed, did you want to have D added back in? So was the new E?
Well, I mean, the question is, what is, I think E is what was intended to be included and should have been included, and I believe council members did get a revised version with E. So unless the town attorney has a view otherwise, that's actually what's before us on second reading.
I think I got lost in all that. So are you saying D is in Delta or E is in Echo?
D, there was an original D when that we approved on. There was a D that mentions
Documentation of
the
existing
site
site.
plan
Yeah.
that was in the ordinance and which we approved on first reading. We said at that time, and Councilmember Berner raised the issue about, evidence of existing site conditions, and we agreed at that time that prior to second reading, we would add a new paragraph E, reflecting the requirement for photographic evidence in a tree survey. So you have both D and E. It was simply to add E to what had been approved on first reading.
Okay, E wasn't in what was passed out just before the meeting. That's what I was wondering.
But I thought we did subsequently, I thought we circulated it to
No, so that's
okay.
Which I'm fine with. If that's how we're doing. I just want to make sure I was tracking.
Well, no, D doesn't need to be, what was actually, so this was, what was actually circulated? Okay, so there are two, what was in the books was incorrect, and what was circulated was not correct.
right, because remember we
There's needs to be a combination of the two.
Yeah, we need
So there, just for clarity, for everybody's clarity, there should be A, B, C, D, and E. D is what was approved on first reading, which is the reference to site plan, and E is the new language regarding documentation of existing site conditions. And there was additional sentence after that. Are we all clear on? No? It's going to get worse with regard to the procurement ordinance. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Next agenda item is, as referenced, ordinance 2025-07, which is second and final reading of the repeal and replacement of Article 4, Finance and Taxation, Chapter 4, dealing with procurement and purchasing. Just before I entertain a motion, what we have here now is in front of everybody is different documents. What I can tell you is that when we approved this on first reading, there was a very robust discussion at our special call meeting, and council members had a number of proposed changes. All of those were incorporated by the town attorneys, Mac's colleague, Nick Nicholson, and those were reflected in a draft that was dated 3/19. What you have in the books includes all of that, those just aren't redlined, and there have been a couple of other little more modest iterations subsequent thereto. So what you have, I believe, is something entitled 328 Final Edits, which is what is before the council now for approval on second reading, incorporating all the changes that had heretofore been discussed. And so that's kind of the status. If I could entertain a motion for approval of the new procurement policy on second reading.
So moved.
Second.
Now discussion.
So for the purpose of here, if you're looking at something that has yellow highlighting, just before this meeting, I took the edits from 314 and highlighted them, and the edits from 319 and highlighted them to the best of my ability. I think I got everything, but please don't hold me to that. And then there's still some minor edits in blue/red in this document, like on page 16.
That were subsequent to 319.
They were subsequent to 319. So that's what the yellow is 314 recommended changes and 319 recommended changes to the best of my ability.
Thank you, Luke.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
So I have just some really simple things. This document is way better. I like it a lot. There's a administrative thing on page 5, I'm sorry. Under invitation for bids, there's 2 number 1s, so that's just,
Yep.
Good catch.
And it goes through the whole sequence. You have to
Yeah.
change to 2, 3, 4,
right.
5, 6, 7, all the way through page 7.
Okay, and then I recall our current policy somewhere talks about not breaking up a contract into little or smaller components to get under the $5,000 threshold for exempted items. So I'm going back up. On page 16, paragraph J2 talks about purchases under $5,000. These are exempt from the pre-qualification, or these are exempted items from these procedures. Our current policy, somewhere in the body, talks about you're not allowed to break up a purchase order or a contract into subcomponents to get under the $5,000 threshold. I would like those kinds of words to be added in here.
I certainly don't have any problem with that. There's going to be inevitably, some discretion involved as to what constitutes a series of purchases or not. But yes, the language, okay, fair enough. We can certainly include language that mirrors that in the existing ordinance.
And then I just have a question, I guess, for Mac. This is my last thing. This has to do with resolving protests. On page 22, starts in 21, goes to 22. It talks about if there is a protest that is not resolved by mutual agreement, you need to go to mediation within 10 calendar days of the notice of protest. I mean, is it possible to get a mediator that quickly, within 10 days?
It is. You may not necessarily get your first choice, just given booking and availability, but
Okay, all right, I just wanted to make sure that was possible. Okay, thank you.
I think, I'm just looking at the notes you made, Luke, on page 14. I think you wrote after B, what, question mark?
Yeah, there's some language missing, and we'll need to include that. There are also some other kind of conforming changes. There's not a consistency in for example, capitalizing certain things, and we'll make all those cleanup changes as well.
What is the what that's missing?
I'm not sure that I have the language in front. I think it's just of the bid opportunity. I mean, I think that's all it is.
Yeah, I
Seems
think
pretty
so.
straightforward.
Yeah.
It should be something like that, yeah.
Page 14, B, the last circle there with what? See that up top? Where word was left off. I think it's opportunities.
And I believe there's similar language elsewhere in this where you're not precluded from notifying other companies. So it should conform to that.
There was also, just since you talked about my chicken scratch, on page, one of the pages I scratched through mayor and then wrote something, and it's page 8.
Page 8, yeah.
Just read it as is written or as is typed, and don't worry about that chicken scratch. The mayor is the acceptable language. Thanks, Stat.
Scratched out your scratch.
Are there any other comments or proposed changes? There is one other change that I would like to propose, fairly minor one, on page 11. The small purchases section, it's right now 10,000 to 20,000 for the mayor. And what I would like to propose is that actually is the 5,000 to 20,000, and this is kind of separate from the other procedures because with regard to department head, the town administrator, the town treasurer, those are all for budgeted items only. This section would include unbudgeted items, gives the mayor authority, but I would like to add or suggest adding that with concurrence of another council member.
I would support that.
I'm all right with that.
All right. This is on small purchases number 3.
Page 11.
So it'd be 5,000 to 20,000, but then with the concurrence of another. Pardon?
4. Sorry,
No,
it's 4.
no. This is this is the mayor's authority to authorize purchases up to $20,000 and lesser amounts even if they are not already part of the budget. So it's slightly different than the other purchase authorities for a department head and or the town administrator and treasurer. It would be 5,000 to 20,000.
That's not
It says 10 to 20.
I'm saying change it to 5, yes.
Okay.
But with concurrence of another council. That's more consistent with our current policy,
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
right? Any other comments or discussion?
Not that hard.
Okay. Thank you, Luke, for pulling that together. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. It is approved. Moving on to new business. First item of new business is ordinance proposed ordinance 2025-04 to amend the zoning permit section and the definitional section. And this will require a public hearing. This is a recommendation of the Planning Commission, but first, Petraeus and John can give us some background and context on this proposed change.
So this is proposed text amendment that affects zoning permits and the definition. So it's section 12-165, zoning permits, 12-374 definitions. So the proposed amendments to the zoning permit and definition sections is to add fences, docks, erosion control devices, and bulkheads to the items in which a zoning permit shall be required. The amendment also adds consistent definitions to the zoning code. The proposed ordinance allows the initial stages of review for docks, bulkheads, and other erosion control devices to help educate property owners on green or hybrid solutions by having the applicant formally submit for review ahead of or at the same time to the state. The ordinance also allows the town to require the applicant to provide information that the proposed structure may not be an adverse impact to the adjacent property owners. The ordinance is not intended to be cross-jurisdictional bounds, but to provide consistency to local standards. In addition, this amendment codifies a current practice for structures adjacent to the critical line, which responds to the comprehensive marsh management plan. Planning staff also recommends Town Council amend the Municipal Code Chapter 2 bank retention systems to reflect the standard review practice.
And do we move to first reading, or we have to public hearing first? Okay, entertain a motion to enter the public hearing to discuss the proposed recommendation from the Planning Commission.
So moved.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
We are now in public hearing. Any comments from members of the public? Seeing none, I would entertain a motion to return to regular session.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay.
Is that an April Fool's joke? Nobody had comments?
Pardon?
Is that an April Fool's joke? Nobody had comments?
I would now entertain a motion for approval of the changes to the zoning code as proposed recommended by the Planning Commission.
So moved.
Second.
Discussion. I do have one issue, a couple of issues that I had raised with Petraea. One, I have concerns at this juncture about, I have no problems at all with the general concept of erosion control devices. And we've discussed that previously in a wide variety of different settings, including our strategic planning meetings. However, there's now an inclusion of fences in this, which had not been part of that conversation. It's not that I'm necessarily opposed to a requirement for a zoning permit of fences of a certain type, but this is pretty open-ended. It requires a zoning permit for literally any fence, which I think is overbroad. So I would either recommend that we delete fences at this juncture, or at the very least, prior to second reading. As you will note, the H above, the new H above, says installation of any sign as specified within this article. It's not just requiring a zoning permit for any sign, it's only for certain signs. Either we delete fences altogether, come back at another time, or between now and second reading, that we have something similar, that fences as specified within this article. So it literally, because I'm thinking of our neighbor that puts the little kind of 1 foot temporary little things around their garden or something that arguably would constitute a fence.
Well, I didn't think of what you described, the 1 or 2 foot thing as a fence. So I'm sitting here, I personally kind of like the idea of requiring the permit, because other than Ocean Green, I don't think there's any fences anywhere in the island.
Preserve.
Oh,
Preserve.
there were many fences.
What's at the preserve?
They have their regime has fences along roadside, all along Preserve.
Oh, you mean like those, oh, I know the kind of phone, yes. I
And
wasn't
then
thinking of
more
that.
and more,
Yes.
there's a bunch in Rhett's Bluff that are fences like you'd think of as backyard fences that the ARB is allowing that give people who have dogs protection from basically alligators coming into the yard. So they're 4 feet high, they're painted green, 2x6s, and they've got the strong wire mesh. They're attractive and they fit within the environment.
And there are several fences along Flyway, both generally as well as around I think one house has a tennis court or something like that.
All right, so I don't,
Yeah, there's one on Turtle on the third hole.
I wasn't ready for this discussion, but do our ordinances or codes define what kind of fences are or are not allowed?
There is a definition in the ordinance. A fence or wall means an upright barrier or structure, including any gate which is part thereof, comprised of any material, including without limitation, hedgerow or other plant material, which serves to enclose, divide, or protect, confine, screen, or mark the boundary of an area or structure or any portion thereof. We do have, under the accessory structures requirements, that a fence cannot be any higher than 5 feet tall and must be set back from a property line by 5 feet.
Okay, so we're getting down a road that I wasn't planning on getting on, but I'm just saying in a generic comment, I would not want a chain link fence. I don't think any of us would. But that's why I asked the question. It didn't sound like what she read would prohibit a chain link fence.
There is nothing that has been the subject of architectural control administered by the ARB heretofore with regard to fences, because the general covenants specifically provide, which covers all property on Kiowa Island, which are not administered by the town, prohibits the construction of a building, fence, or structure without the approval of the company / ARB. So they've been the arbiter of fences heretofore. Whether the town wants to get into the kinds or types of fences, we could certainly go down that path. This doesn't solve for that. This simply, in my view, I'm not saying we may not want to consider that. My view is this is simply overbroad because it literally says a fence of any kind requires a zoning permit.
Okay,
And-
so-
And I'm just thinking, like, for example, in our neighborhood, which we didn't get one, but this wasn't in here, in Riverview, there is the gate for the road.
Yes.
Then there's a little walkway right by the side of it. Recently, the board approved, I wasn't on the board, but approved putting in a little gate and a little 2-foot fence on either side of that walkway. So was no longer open. Now, whether that's the type of thing that in the future council wants to require a zoning permit for, I don't know. I mean, I haven't given that a lot of thought myself as to how expansive we would want this to be, if at all. So my only suggestion was at this juncture, because we haven't had a lot of discussion about it, either because this was added and this is supposed to be about erosion control, and this is not that. Either remove fences for now, then come back to us another time, or at the very least, as defined or subject, criteria referenced somewhere else in the zoning code.
Okay, I'm okay with what you're saying.
I do like the idea of keeping fences, and as opposed to getting back to it later, when's later going to be. Maybe a consideration of what Alexandria did was they listed what's permitted by ordinance, and so you could give those definitions of what's already permitted.
Well, it's not going to be so much permitting,
those.
it's just going to be kind of to specify in what instance, what type of fence would require
It accomplishes the same thing.
a permit.
It's permitted by ordinance, so it
obtaining a
doesn't
permit.
require a permit.
Completely different set of criteria as to whether or not, you have criteria as to whether that would be permittable or not. But
I'm just saying they don't need to pursue a permit in those circumstances.
My bias on this one would be to leave it in until I have good reason for taking it out. I would prefer a minimum of fencing go up on the island. And if this would help in that part, if that initiative, I'm for it.
Well, you know, and an example is some people they have ground level pools. You almost have to have a pool
There's one on
around them.
Ruddy Turnstone that doesn't.
What's that?
There's one on Ruddy Turnstone that doesn't.
I'm generally for public safety purposes, because you've a lot of children around and things like
Well,
that.
building code requires
Yeah,
that if you don't have a
yeah.
cover.
I guess it's grandfathered then, the one that I know.
So I'm going to take a little bit different approach on this. Given that I'm involved in some of this right now, full disclosure, I think that this extends too much regulation on the property owner, too much burden. I already know that for a erosion control, you have to go through the ARB, you have to go through the state for permitting and what type of you use, and then you have building permit requirements, and to put zoning requirements on top of that that really repeats exactly what the ARB requires and what the state requires, I think is redundant and unnecessary. The other thing in here that talks about educating somebody on the living shoreline, you go through that education process in the ARB review, in the engineering design review, and with the state. And to do it a fourth time is going to start to irritate people. I'm already irritated, and I've only done it 3 times. But I think it's just so redundant to what's already in place. And I think the building permit, the ARB, and the state certainly cover all the issues around bulkheads, especially. I think this is wholly unnecessary and creates, quite frankly, more burden on the town to administer. So unless we're going to go down the path of replacing everything and codifying everything the ARB does, I think we're in a good spot right now. And I could speak for an hour on this topic, but I'm going to stop. But that would be my very strong passion is we have this covered 3 times already. A 4th time is not doing us anything other than creating more work for the staff.
Would you eliminate other of those letters? Or
I
just
wouldn't
fences?
do any of this at all because all of this is covered by the ARB.
And
The fences aren't covered by the state, but everything else is covered by the ARB and the
And I
building.
think because the ARB status is still in transition, I'm less bothered by the redundancies.
So a couple of things, Councilmember Farrell, is I'm going to respectfully disagree that all this is necessarily covered or that there isn't a role for the town. And a lot of this goes back to the conversation I think we had, a fairly lengthy one, at the strategic planning meeting. First, the ARB, again, the language of the general covenants only covers buildings, fences, and structures. A real question as to whether a berm, a revetment, or other constitutes a structure that would be covered by the general covenants. That's number one.
But a bulkhead or a fence certainly would, but okay.
Fence, because it's specifically identified. You'd have to make the conclusion that all these other things constitute a structure, which I think would be subject to some debate on the part of some folks. But the other issue is we know there are instances where the ARB has approved things where there may be objections on the part of adjacent property owners, and that's been kind of a recurrent thing. That's one reason why there's a desire to transition control of the ARB, because decisions are made by an unaccountable developer who has a different set of economic interests than do other entities. With regard to the state, to be clear, the state is only has regulatory jurisdiction with regard to those things and waterward of the critical line. There may be instances in where you're building these structures that are landward of the critical line, in which case there would be a separate town interest wholly apart from the state interest. In addition, one of the things we had discussed, and one of my concerns is that and this is with regard to things on the beach as well as in the marshes, is the state may approve something without having any particular care or concern about the impact of that one structure or erosion control device on the surrounding adjacent properties of the neighborhood as a whole or the island as a whole. And it strikes me that regardless of what the state may view with regard to the permissibility of any one of a erosion control device, that we know our own situation better than the state does. Because the state does have express jurisdiction under state law, their approval is required for anything waterward of the critical line. Just in my view, that shouldn't preclude the town from also having an interest in deciding whether or not that's in the best interest of the community as a whole. But I appreciate the issues that it presents for individual property owners, I do.
But when you talk about whether it's good or not for the, you have a ARB process and a building permit process that does that too. To add another layer of zoning process, I just see that as still, again, redundant for the exact reasons you suggested.
Well, building permit process doesn't make these kinds of evaluations. The building permit process only determine whether something is meets relevant code. It doesn't address these kind of, just like the same conversations we've had about stormwater management. Reason why we're passing stormwater management regulations is because of potential impacts on adjacent properties, downstream, what have you. You build, a lot of impervious surface in one property, and it can have an adverse impact on adjacent properties, and it could result in flooding. That's one of the reasons why we're strengthening our stormwater management for exactly these same kinds of reasons. I completely get the issues about multiple jurisdictions and compliance issues, and there's no question this would pose more of a burden relative to the status quo. No question about that.
I still think there's a disconnect here. So fences are generically approved subject to ARB guidelines. There's nothing in the zoning code that prohibits fences or prohibits docks, and that's what I'm saying. I don't think there should be anything in the zoning code that prohibits these things. They should be on a as determined basis.
I'm not disagreeing with you on I understand that. I'm not disagreeing with you on fences. Fences is an aesthetic issue. And one might argue, but I take your point that even is there a town interest in not having a chain link fence? I don't know. Is that really public health, safety, or welfare? It's protecting property values, but that's clearly a province of an HOA, wholly apart from the independent ARB. So fences I wouldn't have an issue with. I understand I could kind of go either way. I'm on the fence on fences. But I think it presents a very different issue with regard to erosion control devices, because that's a broader community interest in health, safety, and welfare issue.
Yeah, it's been presented to me as an aesthetics issue.
Really?
How did the golfers view it from the golf course? That's exactly how it comes out. Huh. And my response is I don't really care about the golfers viewing it from the golf course. I'm concerned about erosion control and pond health. And that's what my concern is, and that I think is a legitimate reason to have erosion control. Same with marsh. If you're concerned about erosion and marsh health, then revetments or some types of bulkheads are certainly appropriate. And I talked to the engineer today about this, and he will tell you that there are different solutions for different locations, that a living shoreline bulkhead is not appropriate in certain locations.
Well, there's no obligation. I mean, this does not preclude the permitting of any one of these erosion control approaches. This simply says a zoning permit is required, so there is an evaluation that would be subject to whatever criteria would be established by the planning department.
And the planning department has a desire at this point, I won't say a bias, but a desire to have more living shorelines that are not always appropriate. And so if you get to a point where somebody's saying from the planning, but you really need to use a living shoreline, and everybody else, the engineer and everybody's determined that's not what I want or is appropriate, then you're going to lose a situation where the state has approved it and the ARB has approved it.
Well, town attorney who's been town attorney for IOP, and I'm not sure Hanahan may have dealt with some of these issues, but I think there is a general bias against hardened structures where non-hardened structures can address the issue. That's not to say that hardened structures aren't sometimes approved, and nothing in what is being proposed here addresses the issue of whether or not breakwaters, bulkheads, joins, gretties, revetments, or seawalls would be approved or not. This is simply saying, this is for the first time giving the town clear authority to consider whether those things are appropriate to the circumstances.
Okay, because it's an exhibit, a part of the exhibits, look at the letter that's in here dated January 17th to the South Carolina Department of Health Education and Environmental Control from Mr. Taylor. You look at that third full paragraph and you read through it. Effectively, what it's saying is the town has a marsh management plan. It guides the town and how they think about working with property owners to come up with solutions. And they talk about living solutions, living shorelines, and how they effectively advocate for living shorelines rather than creating a barrier between the shore and water. Go through this. So there will be an advocacy, at least based on this exhibit, for a specific type of barrier. And again, talking to engineers, they say that there's appropriate times for that and there's not appropriate times for that. But this is creating, the way I read this is creating a bias in the town to have living shorelines where they may or may not be appropriate.
Well,
As part of the zoning code.
This is just the planning department responding to...
Zoning.
What's that?
Planning and zoning.
Yes, but it's planning department responding to somebody's request to the state, and the state requested the town's input, and the staff provided that, I believe. This is not reflected, this particular policy, which I've got to sit down and discuss with staff, is not reflected, and I don't believe we have anything yet as to what constitutes criteria or guidelines for approving erosion control devices in particular situations. We're not there yet.
Then I would say we probably ought to think about that and get there first before we cover that and require that as another step in building something where we already have pretty onerous processes in place for any type of construction on the island. With good reason, the island looks like it does because of the processes, and I would advocate that it's a lot in part to the ARB. But we're getting to a point where there's a lot of redundancy in what we're doing and creating more work for the staff, and thus we're going to need a bigger staff to accomplish things that maybe we don't need as much regulation. One good regulation is better than 4 weak regulations.
So I invite others to jump in, and I think it's very good and healthy conversation. My bias is always towards less regulation rather than more. The issue where I come out is there a public interest in regulating certain matters that heretofore have been regulated solely by private interest? And is it necessarily the case that those private interests will always act in the public interest? And I think that's where the concern traps. That's why we've started onboarding more of these types, like we did the tree ordinance, in part because we saw evidence of instances in which the private actors did not necessarily act in the public interest.
I'll jump in also then, because I was waiting for you to kind of run the course of this, but I do have some thoughts. One, I've built fences in other communities, and a fence has always been a permittable ordinance thing. I understand the aesthetic, and if there's an aesthetic aspect that is an ARB purview, that's fine. I do think the ARB overreaches its authority and the town's authority in many cases, and we've allowed that to happen. And I do think that the town needs to put in the underlying foundation of the municipal authority and what's going on. I went through an ARB process for something very simple last week, and they weren't even following their own policy. So I'm very, it finally prevailed. And it was simple. I was putting in a roof. And our community manager had to share with the ARB their policy back to them to tell them, no, this is okay. That's the reason the regime approved it. So I also am leery of a private, somewhat opaque organization that does a lot of rule setting, driving so much of what's going on in the town. I'm mindful of what you're saying, Luke, because I go through it too. I don't want to set more red tape or more processes in place. But I do think there needs to be a foundation of municipal authority in how things are playing out. And maybe the ARB needs to change what its role is as a subsequent thing of that. I'm not sure the town needs to bend on that. I think maybe the private organization that has overstepped what I think their charter is needs to do that. The third thing when it comes to barriers and erosion control and things like that, I'm flight following one in my community right now. And my experience has been different than what I think I heard you say, Luke. The state approved hard barrier, wall. There's some people that want to have living reef. The engineering in my read shows that living reef won't do it. There's a whole scuffle going on over it right now. My discussion with the planning department, tell me if I'm portraying this differently than you saw it portray, is that the engineering also supports, I've seen through fight following that where I wish the town had given itself more authority to be involved in this. I think it might have actually precluded some of the consternation that's going on in the community right now had the town given itself more of a role to address these things.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to all of that. And I also believe that there needs to be judgment in the process. Because some things will work, some things won't work. Some things either one will work, and it's just kind of then becomes a bias, which is least expensive, which will best, which has the most beautification. So I think that's right. We now have 3 organizations that all have some flexibility to work with clients and consumers, both with and against you. And now we're putting a 4th in there. So we got 4 levels of subjectivity rather than 3.
What's the 4?
ARB, building, and
Well,
state.
building is town. I mean, and again, the building is just building code. Most of this stuff isn't building code.
It's not just building code. There's design requirements embedded in that, and where you have to turn the corners back for height requirements for fences, all those things. So they can be adjusted, but there's a code for building requirements. Okay, like there's a requirement for building your house certain level above flood level. So, but there's subjectivity in all 3 of those, I'll call them environments. And now we're putting a 4th level of permitting that has some subjectivity that may or may not have some bias because we think that there's not enough, a private entity has some involvement and 2 other public entity has involvement. I think it's just, again, my bias is decide which regulation we're going to stand by and go with that. But to have a 4th entity involved in this I don't think solves the problem. All it does is going to make it more difficult for homeowners to get their job done and more expensive.
So respectfully, now whether, again, I want to be careful how I say this. I don't give any particular credence to the developer / ARB's view with regard to erosion control devices. It would be my personal view that is not something that is necessarily covered by the general covenants. So whether a particular homeowner chooses or not how it wants to defer to the ARB's own interpretation of its authority is up to them. What I can say is on behalf of the town administration, whether individual homeowners want to do this, the town administration has made very clear that it's going to look at any assertions of authority with a strict eye as to the language under the general covenants or under any conveyance agreements with the town. So if something's not clearly a structure If it's not a commercial sign, if it's something that's public health, safety, and welfare, et cetera, there's going to be a view that, thank you very much, I understand what your position is, I don't see that in the language of the documents. Now, I understand that the community is, by and large, just kind of abdicated on that, but that's up to the individual homeowner or regime, property regime. But the bigger picture, Councilmember Farrell, is I don't understand what credence the ARB would have with regard to flood control issues, erosion control issues. And my view is there's a community interest in those matters, and that the town, to your point, needs to have some role in that.
I was very frustrated as a community member 2 and 3 years ago when I was trying to petition both the ARB and the town with the Beachwalker developments. And the ARB punted, and the town didn't have authority to do it, in the town's own words.
Last thing I'm going to say on this, I totally appreciate your frustration with the process. Probably everybody sitting up here on this dais has been involved with an ARB negotiation, and sometimes you just throw up your hands and say, okay, do it your way. I lose. As far as the bias on the part of the planning department to always go with a living shoreline type of approach, as opposed to, not always, but the bias being there to tend to go toward the living shoreline as opposed to a bulkhead or a revetment, something that's more concrete and firm and unmovable. I have not seen that in working with the Planning Commission now for the last several years, whether as a member or as a councilman. I think
And to be clear, I didn't suggest that there was any. I'm just suggesting the way this document is written,
this is just one
it implies there could be a bias growing.
I'm not, that bias doesn't concern me. I haven't seen it evidenced, and I've seen a very rational approach to erosion control as evidenced by the Planning Commission and the planning staff. So that is not a concern of mine. The rest of it, the frustration over the number of processes, I kind of am leaning toward what Lance said. I kind of like having the additional, I believe that the town is going to be more consistent in applying fair standards than other agencies or commissions or committees might be. So my bias is to go that way. As far as one little fence word,
Okay, so maybe just to close this down, at least from my perspective, again, my issue is if we did away with the ARB and we did away with the state, then I'm happy with the town and the building department doing this. It's the number of different entities that are involved, and adding another one for limited benefit because some other entity might not do their job just right doesn't work for me. I'd rather have either the other entity do their job right or the town council outlaw any private entity's ability to do this type of stuff. But a bulkhead is a structure, a fence is a structure. I think they're going to define that, and it gives them authority. I just don't want more regulation is what I'm really advocating against, where I think we have adequate regulation already. And again, I don't suggest there's any bias anywhere. I just suggest that there's potential for it going forward, especially if you put more regulation in. Thank you for allowing me to beat this dead horse. Thank you all.
So I'm not quite sure where we are. We do have a motion pending for approval of the Planning Commission's recommendations. I've expressed my own reservations about the inclusion of fences, at least an unqualified inclusion of fences, but we could certainly address that before but if there is to be included a reference to fences, which I'm not against, I think it needs to be somewhat further defined, similar to what the language is with regard to sign. And then those are my comments about fences. Councilmember Farrell has raised his comments and concerns about whether fences and docks erosion control of devices. But I'm not sure there appears to be a consensus for anything either deleting fences, changing the language of fences at this point in time, or removing the underlying permitting process for docks, erosion control devices, or structures. So we have a motion pending, and this is just first reading. If there's no further discussion, I call for a vote on the motion. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
You're voting on what's
Could
in front of us.
abstain.
Yes. Okay, motion carries. Thank you. Next agenda item is also a recommendation of the Planning Commission, first reading, and it's also require public hearing of ordinance 2025-05. This is to amend the process regarding review and approval of development agreements. It primarily focuses on Planning Commission process, but there are also some substantive changes with regard to the town's role. Any background or context, Petrea, before we move into public hearing?
The proposed amendment is to clearly outline the review procedure for development agreements, allowing for a pre-application meeting with applicants to review these requirements. A formal submittal will then be reviewed by the planning director for completeness, and a planning workshop will be scheduled to allow a review of the proposed agreement and to be discussed, and the Planning Commission to provide feedback without taking any action. A formal presentation is then scheduled for review and recommendation by the Planning Commission. After receiving the Planning Commission recommendation, Town Council shall hold at least 2 public hearings prior to voting on the approval of the proposed development agreement. That's per state requirements. The proposed ordinance clarifies that all major modifications to the development agreement must have Planning Commission provide a review and recommendation to Town Council prior to being approved by Town Council. But minor modifications may be approved by Town Council without Planning Commission review and recommendation. So this criteria follows the criteria that is currently being used to review planned developments in our ordinance.
Any questions of Petrea? I would note, just following up what she said, this was driven by the fact that if you look at the current language pertaining to development agreements, which development agreements, as we've learned, can impact the community more than virtually any type of development regulation or agreement, that the review process for Planning Commission and even for Council is extraordinarily cursory for development agreements under our existing statute. In stark contrast to annexation, plan development, site review, et cetera. And for example, current code is simply that the Planning Commission shall review agreements for consistency and shall make a recommendation to the Town Council, full stop. That's the entirety of the review process, involvement of the Planning Commission in a development agreement. The other issue, which has always been stuck in my craw, is this concept that the council can approve and amend a development agreement, can amend a development agreement 6 ways to Sunday, and do so without any public hearing process, and only by voice vote, which has always been an issue. This begins to address all of that. But if there are no other comments or questions for Petrea, and then we can move into public hearing.
I have just one.
Yeah.
How do you define, or is it codified somewhere, what major versus minor modification is?
Yes, it's defined. The last page, 3 of 3, number 6. So any modification to the development standards, that includes use standard setbacks, buffers, building heights, lot coverage, or development schedule, or term period outlined in the development agreement, would be considered a major modification. Items which are clerical or ministerial in nature are considered minor modifications to the development agreement and may be reviewed and approved by the town council by a simple majority vote.
Councilmember Farrell, I would note that the state statute enabling the Local Development Agreement Act references major modifications as requiring, I've always argued that a major modification requires a town council approval by ordinance, the same method for approval of the development agreement in the first instance. The town attorney's predecessor took a different view on that. Major modification is not actually defined in the state statute anywhere, and I haven't seen any case law. You may be aware of some that really defines what that is. What I've been conveyed is, well, apparently prior councils have considered every amendment to the development agreement, all of which have been approved by resolution rather than ordinance, to be minor modifications. And obviously we know that some of those amendments were pretty sweeping in their scope and had significant impact. This at least tries to put some meat on those bones. And we can questions before we get into the actual discussion. We should probably move into public hearing and then into you.
I move that we move into public hearing.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. We are now in public hearing. Public comments. Hearing none, entertain a motion for returning to regular session.
So move.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, I would now entertain a motion for approval of ordinance 2025-05 on first reading.
So moved.
Yeah, second. And
Okay,
can I say
discussion,
something?
yes.
Yeah, this is one of the sweetest documents that I've seen since I've been on council. It is clear, it is sane, and it is absolutely necessary. My big question, reviewing all of this before the meeting, was what's the genesis? Why now? I think that you've answered that. I didn't realize that our current process was so flawed. I think this is perfect.
My only, well, I have two questions. One is, I'm thinking that both the initial approval of the development agreement and any major improvements should be by ordinance.
Correct. I agree. And that's, I was going to go there as
Okay.
well.
And then my second one, given what I've seen happen with the planned development next door, and I don't know the appropriate word for it, but the Health and Wellness Village,
Island Park Place is what
Allen
they
Park
mean.
Place, given that I've seen the Planning Commission vote 7-0 against it, and it be a very close vote in the town council, I would like to see this more than just a simple majority, but a super majority in both cases, where you approve it and or have major amendments. I'd rather see a super majority.
I go along with that.
That would be four of us, right?
And I didn't think of the right words, but I was having a similar thought, so you said that well. I agree with that too.
I think a simple majority, it leaves too much to chance. And again, just based on what we've seen from the lobbying and what's going on with Charleston, I think that's an instructive lesson to learn, where a supermajority solves a problem and puts the majority of the community in a better spot to be represented by town council, broadly speaking.
Yep, I agree.
So a couple observations in that regard, and I'm not agreeing or
You can disagree, it's
No,
okay.
I'm not agreeing or disagreeing at this juncture. The repeated references in here by a simple majority were, I'm not sure why they were in there. You don't find that anywhere else in the code with regard to other things. I mean, it just, approved by town council requires a majority. So the simple majority. Now, whether you want a super majority, but I would note that, are you suggesting that that be true only with regard to a development agreement? What we had with Island Park Place was a planned development. That supermajority requirement isn't currently embedded in the code with regard to planned developments. Would that be the case with annexation? Would that be the case with, I don't know, what, this, that, or the other thing? while I generally think there should be a high bar, and I appreciate that, you were on the cusp there, I start getting a little nervous about how far we go down that path. But I'm not averse to having that requirement, but if we're going to apply it here, we should consider applying it consistently to kind of major the things that have a substantial impact on the community.
And I think you raise a great point, because we wouldn't want to be inconsistent with this versus something else like a PUD that accomplishes a very similar thing. And so I do think we ought to have the discussion on each one of those issues, have it separately, because I don't know how just off the top of my head, whether I think about annexation is the same as the development part of this, just knowing the sensitivity of the island constituents around development in general. But I definitely think we should put that on the list and talk about that decision process for all of those big issues.
Well, I'll just remind you that, there was an extraordinary amount of sensitivity to annexation, and in fact, as a result of that sensitivity, the town did enact a fairly extensive review procedure for annexations. It did not require a supermajority vote, but there was an extensive public hearing and decisional criteria process that had not pre-existed. I would want to work with council and staff on some kind of slight modifications to what is now 5, 6, and 7, the ordering thereof, to clarify that yes, anything has to be done by ordinance, but this language, development agreements may be amended or terminated by consent of the parties involved, it should probably be up above and qualified. Again, the prior town attorney had taken the view, I didn't agree with that, but he had taken the view that that was enabling language and specified, not only enabling, but specified the procedure, and therefore the town could determine what the form of consent was. So if they simply wanted to have a voice vote on a major modification to a development agreement, even it completely rewrote the development agreement, that was acceptable under state law. It should be the case that a development agreement can be modified by the mutual consent of the parties, but the mutual consent of the town needs to be in the form, as you noted, of an ordinance, both with regard to the initial development agreement and, I would argue, any amendment thereto. Might argue any amendment thereto. The only issue where the major modification comes in is the additional involvement of the planning department. One could say something that didn't constitute a major modification in this context could then be approved without a planning commission review by the town council, but it should still require an ordinance, not just a voice vote or a resolution.
So we're on the exact same page, I think. I just hadn't gotten to that one yet, but I was going to suggest that, and I don't know if this accomplishes it, but in number 6, all major modifications or amendments, and take out 7 completely. So major modifications or amendments, then you go through this whole process again. Or either eliminate number 7. It becomes a modification.
So the question, so I would respectfully disagree. The Planning Commission might have a different view that minor modifications are something that are not necessary to go through the entire planning review process.
No, what I'm trying to do is throw major modifications and amendments together. I'm not thinking about the minor modifications. So that line item 7, I'm with you. I don't think that we should be able to just amend it or terminate it without going through the process.
Well, it depends on which project. That's what I'm saying. What we're going to need, I'll work with council, just we kind of move development agreements may be amended or terminated by consent of the parties up above, and then it will be subject to that consent by the town council shall be expressed in the form of an ordinance. And then further, major modifications as defined would be subject to an additional review procedure involving the Planning Commission. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, Mac?
Y'all have got a good definition of major and minor changes in your PD ordinance. That's also really good. It says where
this came from.
increasing buffer sizes or increasing the amount of green space, stuff that nobody's going to have a problem with. Those are all classified as minor. And it says anything not in this list is considered major.
Okay.
I like that. That's like the way I've seen y'all define it in y'all's PD ordinance is about as good as I've seen, because we've litigated that issue in other municipalities and theirs are not clear. So that's another potential thing to look at.
But how do you
before
think about
second
the amendments may be terminated or changed by mutual agreement? Can you throw that with major modifications, or how do you think about that?
We could potentially try to combine it. And I do agree with the mayor. I think if you're adopting a document that legally requires it to go through readings and public hearings, if you're going to modify it, you ought to do that same thing under the doctrine of equal dignity. So I think this is set up nicely, but I hear you want to combine major modifications and amendments together and have those go through that same process.
Yes, sir.
Yep.
So,
And I'm willing to listen to why we shouldn't do that.
I think
It
it's
seems like an
clear.
amendment is a major modification.
I think it's clear the way
So
Luke is
I
describing
think we
it.
have a general understanding what we want to accomplish. So before second reading, I'll work with the staff and council on trying to address what I think reflects the council discussion on this item.
So I only have one
Yes, sir.
minor question.
Yes, sir.
Related to the definition of major and minor. I was surprised to see here that the determination of what is a major and minor is only made by two people. It's the last sentence. It's only made by the planning director and legal counsel. Nobody on town council was involved in that. I was surprised to see that.
That's a good catch. I don't think I would agree with that.
Okay.
I think it's ultimately the town council's determination. We will have criteria, and the planning commission and a planning director can apply the correct criteria as they are in the planning director, but ultimately the determination as to what constitutes a major modification or minor modification should reside with council.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah,
So,
okay.
all right, so that
Okay.
has to be revised too.
Okay. Any other questions, comments?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not an English major. I'm an engineer. What does ministerial mean? So clerical, I understand, like a typo. What would ministerial include? Give me an example.
Like ministerial, where it says you discretionary power.
Yeah, no, that's, you could go, but that is exactly. Without any further questions, comments, we have a motion pending on first reading to approve the changes to section 12-160 on first reading, and prior to second reading that the provisions dealing with amendments and major modifications in the approval process for the town council will be modified pursuant to the discussion that we've had today. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you.
Now that we voted, can I ask one last question about this? It's a detail, sorry. In number 9, there will be review of the development agreement will be reviewed one time every 12 months by the planning director. What would you imagine that purpose would be for?
There actually is a statutory review process. And I don't know, Mac, if the statutory review process, if it specifies in enabling act what the review entails. And we can certainly think about whether that, but the whole the idea that this issue had been raised with regard to prior changes to the development agreement, or whether the development agreement was being complied with. That was the thrust of it. Whether, in fact, the material terms of the development agreement were being complied with by the counterparty. My view had been there have been real questions in that regard. We had never undertaken that review.
If that were the purpose, then I love this and would, I don't know if I can ask that we add that in there, what that purpose is, but that would be great.
Yes, the statute, it says 63190, it says periodic review to assess compliance with agreement, material breach by developer, notice of breach, cure of breach. So it's really just to make sure.
Compliance and review.
Yeah, because I mean, the development agreement is the only creature in like our state law that allows you to truly lock in the zoning. Like, so under a PD, you're vested for the first 2 years and you can request up to 5 annual extensions, but a development agreement, depending on the nature of the acreage and size of the development, I mean, you could lock something up for 20 years, no changes. So it's like it's one of the only legal ways to bind future councils, which is why
Which why there should be a higher bar
Yeah.
to doing that than has heretofore been the case.
Yeah. And that's why they require the periodic review, because if something's approved and 10 years go by and nobody looks at the agreement, things can change.
Not complying with it. Okay, thank you.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. You're still up, Treya. The next agenda items under tab 9, ordinance 2025-06. And this is a amendment to applied water development standards to adjacent properties, definitions, et cetera, that Petrea will provide a background on.
So this is, the proposed amendment will require the BCM, that's Bureau of Coastal Management, critical line buffer to increase from 10 feet to 15 feet for residential properties. The setback will remain unchanged. The purpose of the required buffer is to provide a visual, spatial, and ecological transition zone between development and the island's saltwater marshes, wetlands, waterways, and to protect water quality and wildlife habitat. The comprehensive marsh management plan recommendations and the flood mitigation and sea level rise adaptation report action items, which includes controlling stormwater with vegetative buffer, and it is considered one of the most effective ways to protect salt marsh habitat. An analysis of other South Carolina local governments' marshfront regulations indicates the current town of Kiowa BCM residential buffer is 10 feet, is less than the other local community standards. The Comprehensive Marsh Management Work Group was supportive of this recommendation. So that's the first part of this. Also, subsequent to the Planning Commission approving this, there's been a suggestion that we may want to exempt some selective view pruning, which is currently prohibited in that buffer area. So there is a chart in your material that goes through the analysis of the other local communities and what they require. And then the other piece of this is the definitions, trying to get up to speed. So the town's zoning categories and standards for classes of use includes permitted density, lot size, lot coverage, and it is important to be clear what the definition is for these terms and that they be applied consistently. The proposed amended definitions clarify some of these definitions and includes exclusion of area below the critical area line from the lot area calculation. This also ensures areas that are non-buildable do not count towards lot coverage calculations, such as wetlands. So, and then also a bit of housekeeping. In July 2024, the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control, which was known as DHEC, was split into two agencies, with the environmental component of that agency being renamed to South Carolina Department of Environmental Services, SCDES. The Office of Ocean and Coastal Resource Management previously known as OCRM, is now known as the Bureau of Coastal Management, BCM, and is responsible for all critical area permitting and establishing the critical area line.
Any questions, Petrea, before we move into public hearing?
I heard you read it and I didn't understand it. I apologize. Did you say that the highland area in the buffer zone would not be counted toward lot coverage, or just the in-water area?
The in-water area and areas outside of the critical area would not be counted in lot coverage. That's the clarification in the definition.
What is outside of critical area but not in water? That would just be,
Well, like I think it's defined in here as highland. I think there was some confusion in previous projects of what was counted overall, and in terms of what your lot coverage is. So the effort is to be clearer as to what is currently included. So lot area means the area of the lot shall be the net horizontal area of the lot and shall not include portions of streets, alleys, and areas below the critical area line.
okay, beautiful, thank you.
So this is more restrictive, is the way
I think it's just a clarification.
well, it says lot coverage. What all you did was say the total percentage of lot area you inserted of the highland. So to me, that means if you're restricting the calculation to just the highland area, it's going to be more difficult. It's going to be a smaller amount.
Yeah, that's always
believe
been
that's
the
always
intention and
been
thrust.
the
I
intent.
see the chair of the Planning Commission here, but you may recall not only with regard to this had come up less in some areas with parcels that had marshfront property, including a fair amount of the property.
Right,
The property
yeah.
lines went beyond the critical area, but it was also with regard to the Cape as to, unless you exclude the areas below the critical area, critical line, you allow for much denser development in the developable area.
So you would still be, the total percentage would still be limited to, I guess it's 33% now? Is that correct?
It depends on the zoning of the parcel.
Yeah, I understand that. That's what I'm saying.
It's
So
just clarifying that the denominator has
Yes.
to exclude the non-developable areas below critical.
Right, so that just means you're going to have less lot coverage than one could interpret it today.
Yes, that's correct.
Remind me again.
You have less lot.
Yes, yeah, I
Less
understand.
lot.
The less lot, which to build density, yes.
Yeah, then
which
you
to
have,
build.
yeah, then you have you have to have a smaller
Yeah.
footprint because you have less lot. So again, just to be clear, everybody knows all my business. My lot has eroded, and I own 5 feet of a lagoon on one end, and I own 3 feet of the lagoon on the other end. So when they calculate my lot coverage, that water that I own is not part of my lot. It's only the high ground, which is the right thing to do, right? I think.
That makes sense. I own part of the inlet. So refresh me, the difference between setback and buffer.
So setback applies to building structures, and buffer, we very much limit what can occur in that buffer area. Like you can't go in and add pathways, and there's a list included of what's limited in there. So a buffer is part of the setback, and we're not proposing to change the setback. We're just proposing to increase the buffer area within that setback.
And so I'm trying to understand from a technical perspective. So if a path is going across a bridge, it's going to enter the buffer. So am I being too specific? Because you're going in the buffer area now? Or are you just talking about building a structure?
I'm not sure I
Like,
follow.
It's going to go across the waterway.
Goes across the water, yes.
And we've got a lot of bridges.
Right, that would be, so if you look at F, prohibited activities within the critical line buffer under Exhibit A, the following activities are specifically prohibited within the buffer area: removal, evacuation, or disturbance of existing vegetation or soil, except for minimal disturbance associated with the planting of additional indigenous material, vegetation, planting of various species of grass, shrubs, and trees requiring fertilization, pesticides, herbicides, and or requiring regular maintenance, installation of garden fences or structures, installation of paved or other impervious surfaces, and destruction or addition of plant life which would alter the existing pattern of vegetation. Structures and activities associated with DES BCM approved permits shall be exempt from the above prohibited activities within the required critical line.
The one, thanks for pointing that out. The one I'm scratching as number 4, because a path would be an impervious surface, right?
Right.
So I understand the intent, but I'm concerned that like a walking path is going to get caught up in this unnecessarily. Is that understanding it correctly? If a path is going to go across a bridge?
I think mostly,
Yeah, it would, if there were a bridge, it would supposedly have been permitted by,
Right.
You've got a double negative in here. You look at number 6.
That's what I'm trying to puzzle through.
And it's my own view, I'm fully supportive of the changes to 1276 and the adjustment of the critical line buffer to conform with other communities. I'm not sure why we've ever been, given the critical importance of our marsh, been so much more relaxed about that compared to other communities. I do believe that the prohibited activities is, and we've had some conversations about this and would propose to come back on second reading with some potential adjustments to that. The Petrea already mentioned one, which is to allow for some pruning for view shed. And because in part, I don't believe there's a single parcel on Kiowa Island that is abided by the strict terms of this ordinance right now. That literally this says you can't touch the buffer.
It says, yeah.
I know, and that's just not, I mean, it doesn't reflect reality, nor should it be. I don't think that's really what the
That was kind of where I was trying to go too, that if somebody's going to put native plants in the buffer to help with erosion, should they be allowed to do that?
Well, so I think we need to come back with some adjustments. We don't want to allow a bunch of activities in the prohibited, but I mean, within the buffer, but I think we need to be thoughtful and pragmatic about what makes sense. For example, I've raised the issue with the town staff in a couple of other contexts is we have utility lines and utility works regularly being done within the buffer on the other side of our marshfront property. It doesn't seem to be permitted at all, but obviously it's occurred and it probably has to occur.
Has to occur, yeah.
So
And I'm just thinking there's some beneficial things that
there may
we don't want to exclude, that somebody, that's good for the community, good for the environment, good for everything. So I understand the use case of new development that you mentioned a few minutes ago. So for an existing structure, if you stay within the footprint of the structure, you know, somebody wants to put in a deck within the existing footprint of the structure, is it now prohibited, or has it always been prohibited?
this hasn't changed the setback.
Okay.
It's changed the buffer line, doesn't change the setback line. So
I'm thinking where there's been erosion and the critical line has moved.
Like in Luke's case.
If it's an existing
case,
structure,
actually.
then it's considered a
it
non-conforming
would be a
if you have a
it'd be a
new ordinance.
That's where I was trying to go.
non-conforming structure, and under
The one we did a couple months ago.
council,
number of
I mean, I
things.
believe that non-conforming, at least on the beach side, I don't know for sure on the marsh side, non-conforming structures can generally be repaired and replaced, but they can't be added to, expanded.
And I'm thinking about our, you know, Inlet Cove and Sparrow Pond, where it's elevated, it's on stilts. And if you stay within the footprint, a lot of people do stuff underneath, or put in a deck that's not going to encroach further into the buffer zone. Are we prohibiting that now?
Buffer is, so the setback is the thing you want to think about. for building things. The buffer is an area at the beginning of the setback that's supposed to be undisturbed.
Completely
Buffer of
undisturbed.
10 or 15 feet, then you may or may not have a yard, then you've got your building. And anything you do that building has got to do with the setback from the water line or the critical line. The buffer is just the undisturbed area, part of that setback.
I'm just thinking if you're doing it within the footprint of the existing structure when there's an elevated structure.
But that
considered
structure
disturbing?
is either already in,
Structure's already there.
but I mean, the question is whether that structure is within the, there's a setback requirement. Assuming it had to be built in conformance with the setback requirements at the time, that may have adjusted. But if you're not adding to the area that encroaches upon the setback, I don't think that there is any issue. There would be permitting required to the extent that you are doing any work within the setback area.
If you're not changing the footprint, is my understanding,
Right.
Yeah.
you can keep that
It
footprint.
may be a non-conforming structure, but
Okay, that helped. I
Yeah,
appreciate
like
it.
there's some houses in Sparrow Pond that are 5 feet from the lagoon.
That's right.
And there's a grass, turf, you call it, goes right to the lagoon. They could affect the structure. They're within the setback is, they're non-conforming. And they would probably also be inside the buffer too, because
Plus
by the way, the
those
lagoons
don't
aren't,
have critical lines.
yeah, the lagoons aren't critical line.
if they're saltwater,
Some of them are starting to get classified.
they're
Yeah,
salt
but-
water, they are.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
we've got a pretty-
most of them are not currently classified, even though they are clearly brackish. They're both
We've got a
freshwater
critical
and
line where
saltwater.
we are. We've got a critical line where we are. And so like, I'm just thinking, and I'm gonna try and prolong this, but like replacing their driveway within the structure, I would think that would be okay.
But none of this, what we're talking about today, addresses what you're talking about.
Okay? It doesn't.
All this does today is change the buffer line. Doesn't change the setback line. It simply expands, as Councilmember Farrell noted, that, marsh, there's a setback from the critical line of 30 feet. The first 10 feet of that used to be, you're not supposed to disturb this, now it's 15 feet, but we're going to slightly relax because otherwise, the entire island, you would not be able to see from anywhere, in order to be able to see out, because supposedly it should have been 10 feet of completely undisturbed vegetation. And I don't believe there's a spot on the island where that is actually the case.
Okay, thank you.
It's an exaggeration, but your point is well taken. So I'm sorry.
I would say that's true of any developed parcel. I would be surprised if there's a single developed parcel.
Well,
Yeah, okay.
we take that off.
Where all the natural vegetation still
Where it's not been touched at all.
hasn't been
Yeah.
Patria, again, so what's the overall thing we're discussing is expanding the buffer from 10 to 15 feet. Tell me again what the rationale is.
Well, first of all, it was a recommendation that came from the Comprehensive Marsh Management Plan, as well as the flood adaptation, to help with our water quality next to our water bodies. And then we did the analysis of the local communities to see what everybody else was looking at, and that was when it became rather apparent that we were not keeping up with what the other communities were doing.
But this would only really be for the remaining lots that are not developed, which are few.
No, it would apply.
So if you have a non-conforming property with respect to the buffer, you're not saying you have to.
What do you mean by non-conforming property?
Well, right now you have no vegetation between 10 and 15 feet from the line.
There's no requirement.
Well, that's why I asked
yeah,
the question. So you say a minimum 15-foot vegetative buffer.
That defines the buffer, and then
Right.
what it says is, here's what you can't or can't do.
Right, so, all right, so let's
Here's what you must
let's
do.
talk about your house.
Yep.
Right? So you have landscaping plants planted at 11 feet from the line. You're not going to be required to take them out. Right, that's what I just said. So this is really just for the remaining undeveloped lots.
But going forward, he wouldn't be allowed to trim those properties, trim that grass or those bushes or whatever. They'd remain untrimmed.
Well,
Yeah,
the
I
same
understand.
situation.
Yes, absent
understand.
any further change to this, we do need to, I think, clean up the prohibited acts language. But yes, otherwise, read literally, you could no longer do anything unless it was specifically a DHEC permitted or BCM permitted thing. That's right. And it's been overly restrictive and not really.
Okay, so I guess you guys caught me on a bad day. I am so for the marsh management plan and water health. I just don't get enough time to talk about that. So let me just put that out there. I think that protecting our environment is one of our paramount jobs. I don't think this is doing that. I think when they talk about, when I read the first thing from on the list of bullet points from Morganello and Rose, reduce pollution in stormwater runoff. The biggest reason you get pollution from stormwater runoff is the topography of the land. It's the elevation of the slope as it approaches the water's edge. If it's steep or it's angled or steep, you get more and more water runoff. And moving it back from 10 to 15 feet doesn't affect that at all, unless you stop putting fertilizer in your yard there. The best thing to do is have that land be more level, slow the runoff, have it be absorbed into the soil and filtered by the soil, and then enter your watershed. Okay, so just simply moving the line back, other than taking fertilizer out of it, doesn't really change that stormwater runoff. So what you're doing is you're restricting property owners from using their property to affect, the goal is great. I don't think we're accomplishing what we want to accomplish by doing this. I think there's other ways we do that by encouraging people to level that off and then let it go natural again. Erosion just is going to continue if it's a steep bank, and your marsh, your land's going to erode, and you're going to get that dirt and soil into your marsh and pollute your marshland. So
I think the idea, and I've talked to Matt Smith, Land and Lakes, Kika, is it Matt? Yeah. About our little pond, because there's a certain steepness to it. And he says, yeah, the steepness is its own issues, but he does say the more vegetation you have along that bank and is going to help avoid further runoff into, so more vegetation and the depth of that vegetation.
It's important. It's the right type of vegetation too that has deep roots.
Yeah.
And not high surface roots. So the types of grasses are important, especially on a steep bank.
But yes, level better, but if you don't able, that requires moving a lot of earth or doing other things. Having more vegetation, depth of vegetation, type of vegetation helps with existing conditions.
So to take this the next step, for me, a better solution to improving our marsh and our lagoon health would be to prohibit fertilizers within 30 feet of the lagoon. And the worst culprit on the island is the resort, the golf courses, which put it into the lagoon when they use those big sprayers. So this is kind of like another issue I had a while back. It's a great effort. It's a great attempt. It doesn't accomplish much. There's a bigger carrot out there, a bigger thing we could do to really affect water quality in our lagoons and our marsh. And that's talking about the resort.
Councilmember Farrell, I suspect if you want to recommend something for the Environmental Committee to consider and work with them on other proposed ordinance changes, that's something that we could consider at a future time.
I will. Thank you. It's a great idea.
Valid point.
I did note, and I don't know if she wants to comment, the chair of the Planning Commission here, but this was also approved by the Planning Commission by a 5-0 vote, and I don't kind of know what conversations you guys had about all of that. Sure.
Yeah, just to address your point, this is one step to help with water quality. We are looking at overall stormwater management. And we're backing off a little bit from just pervious surfaces, as, you know, for pervious driveways, that may not address the problem. So we are going to be looking at things you're talking about, of looking at the whole lot and addressing stormwater runoff for the lot as an entirety. So maybe pervious pavers aren't the way to go. Maybe there's certain things to do with changing the topography of the land to keep the water runoff on the land. So we're addressing some of the other things. I think your thing about fertilizer, we did not address that, and that's an excellent thing that I think we should look
I think
at.
you're talking about rain gardens, and that's a great solution.
Rain gardens, other things that we're not just going to focus in on pervious pavers, because that really doesn't address the whole problem of stormwater runoff. So we're, Gene Babinek is working on that and looking at stormwater management as in a holistic approach. So this vegetative thing, the more vegetation, the better it helps the water quality. It's a step. And it's an important step, but we are looking down the road at other things as well.
One other question. What we have existing on the books, can we still ask questions, or should we go for a motion?
Do we not actually have a motion?
I don't think we did yet.
Oh, well, then, did we actually have a public hearing on this one?
Not yet.
I don't think so.
We did not, okay.
You guys, if there are any questions before
So
public hearing?
first, I need to entertain a motion to enter a public hearing with regard to ordinance 2025-06.
So moved.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And we're now in public hearing. Are there any public comments on this?
Wonderful.
There are none. May I entertain a motion to return to regular session?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Okay. Now, may I have a motion to approve ordinance 2025-06 as presented and recommended by the Planning Commission on first reading?
So moved?
Second.
Further discussion.
Yes. So to the extent we have a 10-foot buffer today, does this apply? And you're not supposed to touch anything within the 10-foot buffer, right? Does this apply to the resort?
If it's next to a critical line, yes.
So how is it that every winter they...
Actually, that's a residential requirement. We break our setback and buffers between residential and non-residential.
Well, the setbacks and buffers are larger for non-residential.
Correct.
Deeper, yes.
Correct.
Yeah.
So not that I don't like this, but how is it that they can shave the edge of the ponds all the way to the water every winter and cut the grasses down to this high?
Again, those are probably not critical areas.
They're within a buffer. I mean,
They're probably not, the buffer's only off a critical area line. I suspect.
Which is established by the state.
I suspect
they're
most
off the same lagoon that I'm on.
And
And I have a critical line surveyed in this.
well, okay.
Anything that's on Canvasback Pond, anything that's osprey related,
Okay.
they shave it down to the water's edge. They're into the wetlands and they cut the cattails down.
Then
How
we
does this-
need to look
how do
at,
we-
we need to look at enforcement of our, whether we more rigorously enforce, which I noted we have not done heretofore, 1276. Part of the reason may be because until, 2 or 3 weeks ago, you couldn't actually find 1276. It was literally, if you went online or went into our book, it said, go to the town clerk's office to read what this says. It literally wasn't findable. That may be part of the problem.
So I'm just raising this because if we start to enforce what we have on the books, or we do this and we expand the enforceable zone, I'm going to be...
Not just of the resort, by the way, it's the club, because the club has properties along critical lines.
Yeah, if I'm cited, I'm going to be the first standing in line pointing at every piece of resort property where they shave it right down to the water's edge. So we have an issue going on today where we have to decide if we're going to tolerate that or not going forward, and how are we going to correct that?
And again, there has not been, no question, there has not been compliance with the terms of broadly. There's not been much compliance with 1276 as it exists now. So I think we need to rationalize that. I think the buffers are important. And we want to limit and restrict the activities that occur in the buffers, but does that need to be as prohibitive as drafted right now? It's probably unrealistic.
So if anybody's wondering why I'm so passionate about this, I've been living with this for about the last 6 months. Because as you know, my property is really affected by this, and I'm on the border of the golf course on two sides of my property. So I'm living and breathing everything we've been talking about today, and kind of the pros and cons and frustrations in dealing with permitting and everything else we have to do. So I can offer a lot of firsthand experience, and I apologize if that's too much for everybody.
Any further discussion? So we have a motion to approve the Planning Commission's recommendations for the changes to 1276 on first reading. If that motion is approved, it would be approved subject to the discussion to, before we come back for second reading, to address some of the issues in subparagraph F to make sure that we prohibit those activities we want to prohibit, permit those activities that should be permitted subject to whatever conditions, and that we then have a policy of consistent enforcement.
We're starting enforcement.
So this, if this was pushed back to one of the committees, this would more, from a definitions perspective, this would fall under the resiliency committee's prerogative as opposed to the wildlife slash environmental.
Well, this would go back to the Planning Commission because it comes as a recommendation to the
But
planning.
if we were taking
If you want to start taking a,
recommendation
yes.
with taking a committee look at it before it goes to planning commission, I'm just trying to get direction.
We're talking
here.
about
Which-
a new ordinance and whether you want, we
How
want
do
it
we
to
wanna
be
proceed?
environmental resiliency.
How do
Yeah,
we-
okay, yeah.
Yeah, and
And if we want to just.
And
act on this
it may
ordinance-
be that you can have a conversation with the Planning Commission and it may be something they would take up directly, which is always possible.
yeah, so I think the way I think about this is there's a lot in here that I think needs to be changed, and I think we need to think about enforcement maybe in here or someplace else, and other solutions and the impact of this. I would probably, my preference would be to see this redrafted, some of the corrections made before I voted for or against this, but that's just how I think about this.
Yeah, and I think there are enough open questions here that are really challenging with respect to enforcement, with whether it's the club we're dealing with or the resort that we're dealing with, that we probably should go back and revisit this.
Well, the
Okay,
enforcement
but-
isn't part of this. They have to enforce.
But understand,
we have out there.
this is trying to get as quickly as possible to address some of those issues. If we do nothing, if we defer, delay passage, and punt this down, all of this is current law. So,
But that's a good starting point. So what we have now, let's enforce what we have now. Why are we waiting?
it's extraordinarily onerous. So what we'll have to be monitoring, it's everybody looking at, anytime anybody's doing any pruning or anything around a water's edge.
Yeah, but that's not changing. The dimension of the buffer is changing. So the
But
pruning and the runoffs and the
this would-
pesticides
this-
and all that
This
stuff.
would say, what I'm saying is 1276 is already on the books.
Yeah, so let's enforce it. That's all I'm saying. 'Cause
And we can work on,
apparently we haven't been.
and we can work on adjusting the pruning requirements that are in there,
Exactly.
which we're gonna have to do whether we vote on this or not.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, why do you want to then delay that process? Because we can do that between now and second reading.
I think all we're
Otherwise,
saying
start
is
over, then we're just going to delay, and we're going to be left with a less ideal.
no, let's just start enforcing tomorrow of the current 1276 on a parallel path. We do what Mr. Farrell was referring to.
I just.
Why can't we enforce what we already have?
because we would be literally going, I mean, we're going to have people going to every property around the island, code enforcement officers going on every property, looking whether there's anytime anybody's landscaping, arbor care, anybody else is routinely doing.
Is that going to change? Is that going to change though if we start approving this? That's not changing.
Yeah, yes, that's the whole point, is we would permit those activities which are actually occurring, as opposed to, you're saying, enforce what we have now. Then every time arbor care is going in and doing view pruning for properties that are on the water's edge, which they are on the island regularly doing that, we're going to have a code enforcement officer chasing after them.
I
and
understand,
citing
but what Mr. Farrell was saying, we're more concerned right now with the runoff. I understand the current thing as view pruning and everything else, but it's the runoff that we're more concerned.
There's nothing to do with runoff in this particular ordinance.
Well, the 10 to 15 feet is
Yeah.
got to do with that. I have another question too.
Wait,
is
where does it say,
expanding the buffer from 10 to 15 feet.
Right.
but this doesn't have anything to do with runoff. This isn't saying if we see runoff that's prohibited.
So what you're trying to sell to me then is that this is only for the view? That's what I hear you saying.
What I was suggesting is, right now we have a statute that is as drafted, 1276. Forget about the 15 feet. Forget about the 15 feet. That's the only thing this currently changes, is proposing, is the 10 to 15 feet, where you're not supposed to disturb anything.
Yeah.
And we're not enforcing that statute today.
That's correct. And what we do know is there's a lot of disturbance within 10 feet, whether it's 10 feet or 15 feet, but there's a lot of disturbance along marsh edges and water edges. And it may not be a lot of this kind of disturbance, but it is disturbance. It is removal of vegetation.
So fast forward 3 months, we do what you're suggesting. We approve this in first reading today. Fast forward 3 months, so we now have this document that as redlined approved. They're still going to have the enforcement issue that you just discussed. We're going to have somebody go out and check on arbor care or whoever is. So why is it? I don't understand the difference.
Because what we would do is come back 1 month from now, when we consider this on second reading, we'll have revised this set of prohibited activities to no longer prohibit certain activities which we don't think should be prohibited and which are occurring in the regular.
Okay, fast forward. So we revise it on the second reading. Yep. Fast forward to month 3 again. What are we enforcing?
Whatever is then prohibited. But those things which are already occurring would not necessarily be prohibited.
Okay, what then is prohibited? 3 months? My point is that whatever is going to be prohibited 3 months from today with the second reading is prohibited today. What's different?
For example, what we just talked about is arbor care, just one specific example.
Okay, that's for viewing, but that's why, and I also said like a minute ago, isn't that just for the site view?
It is, but it's currently prohibited. So the question is, right now we should be arguably enforcing that and writing tickets for that. But does anybody actually think we should be prohibiting that? And if not, then let's change the frigging ordinance.
No, I understand. But Luke's point of weed whacking down the.
So that should be.
We can do that tomorrow. We don't have to wait for this ordinance because they're within the 10-foot buffer that exists today.
So
they should not be weed whacking.
So let me give you guys both mental breaks. So I think there's 2 ways we could proceed. And let's just set enforcement aside for the second, okay? So we can proceed, we can approve this as is first reading and edit it and come back in a month or 2 or whenever and then go through it for the second reading. Or we can not approve this and send it back for editing first, then come back next month for the first reading, at the first reading, and then do the month after the second reading. We get to the same place, 3 months down the road, we've got something. my request to send it back was I thought there was a lot of wholesale changes we need to need. But if you think you can articulate what we need to change and we can approve it, then that's okay.
That will be before us. We can have certainly conversations in the interim with Planning Commission and council members in the interim to present something on second reading. That doesn't preclude council from at that time making further changes. Again, the only issue that I would raise is we could certainly do that path. It's a further, at least one more month with, and maybe I simply decide as an administrative matter to tell the code enforcement folks, well, this isn't an enforcement priority. But, you know.
Enforcement is your decision irregardless of what we do.
It's just not a good place to be where we have something that is so overly restrictive that we know is being violated routinely. It's just not a good place to be. I mean, I don't know how other towns look at this, but
sure it's okay. What would you recommend, sir?
What I suggested a path, but if there's not a consensus view on that, that's fine. Mine is that we approve this on first reading. It's the 15 feet with coming before second reading. We'll come back with changes to F that will try to rationalize in a pragmatic way what it is that, what those things we want to remain in there as being prohibited activities and those which we would say are not prohibited activities.
Again, my thought was I think there's more changes than I'd like to see than just changing F. And I don't support the moving from 10 to 15 feet, but I can vote my conscience on this. So we have a motion in front of us, right?
We do.
And that motion is what you just said?
Yes.
All right.
Further conversation? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
I didn't hear you guys vote.
Yeah, we
Aye.
said aye.
Okay.
The echo.
Okay.
I move for a 5-minute break.
Second?
Sorry. I'm taking
We are in recess for 5 minutes.
I'll see you in the bar.
I'm going to Paris Thursdays. That's part of the problem. That's part of the problem. So look, let's talk for a second.
I'm going to try to make the, well,
I'm
all but the
now
last one
having
may be easy. I'm going to try to make the next one easy.
Could be.
Tab 10, next agenda item is approval of the fiscal year 2025. Do we actually, yeah, I guess the meeting is back in order. Approval of the charitable grant funding amounts. We had discussed this at some length at a prior council member, spent 2 or 3 hours. So what I would do is entertain a motion to approve the charitable grants that were recommended by the Ways and Means Committee in the aggregate,
So moved.
all 22 of them. Any discussion?
We spent a lot of time on this, so we're ready. I'm ready to go.
All in favor?
Well, let me just say, again, I think this is a really quality thing that the town is doing. I know there may or may not be some debate, but again, kind of the numbers where they go. Where this money goes to, 10 are going to food banks, in effect. 3 are going to medical, like the free clinics. 3 are going to home improvement, so shelter. And 3 are going to enrichment in general for disabled children. So all this money, in my humble opinion, is being put to great use that the town is donating. So thank you all.
Well, and I would just note that we may want to consider going forward before we get to next year whether the classifications as drafted in the charter are the appropriate ones, whether tighten up, expand. Been a couple of issues of some of these applications which may have been a little bit of a stretch to fit in home, health, or hunger. Also, whether we want to have more rigorous standards with regard to the amount of fees of the funding application that goes to administrative expenses versus program expenses.
And those were not egregious. There was maybe one that was on the borderline that we discussed, but most were kind of 85 to 90% plus going to the program, which was, again, very rewarding.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Tab 11, Councilmember Kay, this is approval of the 2025 Resiliency Committee appointments.
We discussed these in some detail at the last meeting. I believe there's 1 or 2 resumes that are included as an attachment here. If anybody has any questions with respect to any of the individuals on this list, let me know. Otherwise, we have had our first meeting. It was, well, I'm going to plagiarize Russ's word. It was very, very robust. The mayor attended and lent his support behind the concept. And
They did a lot of working before they were a committee.
done a lot of working before we were even a committee. So they came well prepared with instructions. And I think it's going to be, I'm very hopeful, optimistic that we're going to we will come up with some real results.
I apologize. I probably should know this. Do you have a charter for this committee?
Yes,
We
you've
approved
approved
that
it.
last meeting.
I knew I approved 2 for you.
You approved this one, I think it was 2 months ago. It might have been just last month or
2 meetings
just
ago,
well,
1 month ago.
1 month ago.
Do you,
Feels like
do you have are you making a motion?
I'd like to move that we approve the members of this committee as stated.
Second?
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye. We're going to correct the spelling of Petrea's name.
Yes, I know, I had that circled. So.
Yep.
Next agenda item is approval of a Public Safety Committee appointments under tab 12. Councilmember Berner, do you want to present those?
I do. So we're adding the 2 appointed individuals. One is Adam Shubsta, who is a newly employed individual at KICA. He's now in charge of public safety on behalf of KICA. So he is, of course, a very important person to be added to the team. And Jimmy Harrington is now the appointed representative from Freshfields. And he also should be providing his voice and input to this important committee. So I recommend approving both of these appointed individuals.
Are you
putting forth that motion to approve these two appointed individuals.
Second.
Any further discussion?
Yeah, just one thing. Jimmy Harrington, he's an employee of Eden's.
Yes.
I just found out recently, Eden's is not a private corporation. Eden's is actually owned by J.P. Morgan, Blackstone, and the State of New York Common Fund. I thought I would share that with you. About 4% is owned by the principals at Eden's, but their equity is owned by those three entities. J.P. Morgan owns about 38%.
They're still not a publicly traded company, though.
Sorry?
They're still not a publicly traded.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, they are not they're a private entity, but they have three big sponsors. J.P. Morgan owns about 38%, BlackRock about 30%, and Common Fund owns the balance minus 4%, and 4% are owned by the principals. So they have deep pocket backers is another way of thinking about that. And Jimmy Harrington represents Eden.
Okay. Good to know.
All in favor?
Aye.
Next one is a Planning Commission appointment, and this is appointments to fill the term, the seat vacated by Dr. Curran upon his resignation. And we had just a couple of applications, and one very strong application. It's an individual who does not reside here and will not be residing here for some time, and still working full-time and has some other obligations, engagements. Somebody by base dint of resume would love to get involved in town activities and at some point in time. But I met with, and this was the recommendation of the Planning Commission Chair, that Mr. Rob Ryan be appointed to the Planning Commission to fill Dr. Curran's seat. That would be my motion.
Second?
Any discussion?
I also know Mr. Ryan, and he's got great experience as a professional landscape architect. He's a very logical thinker. I think he's going to be a great addition. He's also very balanced and level in approaching different situations. So I'm a huge proponent of Mr. Ryan.
Very
I'll
good.
add to that. I know him, and I also think he'll be a great addition. And the day he put his application in, he was very excited about it, it seemed like.
Good. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Last agenda item, discussion of the TOKI's proposed code enforcement policy. Not any action being considered by the council at this point in time. Certainly the council could establish this as its own policy. At this point in time, this is supposed to be an administrative set of policies. A couple of things here, and I don't know if Saz wants to chime in at some point in time, or Rob as well. The reason for this was that we really don't have any written down code enforcement policies currently. And we've run into some instances recently where there have been questions about the consistency of application. What is the level of fine and how much discretion should be accorded to individual code enforcement officers for a parking violation or anything else? This is to try to establish a kind of routinized set of policies and procedures. So first and foremost, the idea is not to be writing tickets, writing summons. It's to encourage compliance and do so voluntarily to the extent possible, but to the extent that there's a more rigorous enforcement necessary, that there's kind of a stepped up progression of fines, and that all of that is a guideline. At the end of the day, there is still some discretion on the part of the code enforcement officers to impose different levels of fine depending on the circumstances, and some of those types of circumstances or factors or considerations outlined. Now, with that as kind of general context, I think this is a good document. It's been reviewed by, I believe, Barrier Island Ocean Rescue. I don't know, Mac, if you or Boone had taken a look at this. And Stephanie and I had worked on this with the public safety director. So it's tried to put on paper what most municipalities do have on paper. However, now I'm going to kind of step back from that. This whole process led me down one of my many rabbit holes. And it's a rabbit hole that I'm still deep in. And herein lies the issue. And I don't suspect most people realize this, that, this applies to, we write a ticket for violation of any of our municipal code ordinances. And in writing that so-called tickets, it's a uniform summons. And we have conferred jurisdiction on the municipal court. The municipal court, which I hadn't really fully appreciated, is a criminal court. So the posture of the town has been, and this is true of many municipalities, is that every one of our municipal code violations, with a couple of exceptions, and I'll talk about those, is a criminal violation. And when people pay a fine, they are pleading guilty to a crime. It's a misdemeanor, but it's a crime. And I've raised the question, how can it be that, for example, one of our ordinance requirements is you have to fill a hole in the beach after the kids have dug their hole. And we could arguably, code enforcement could write a ticket for that summons, and somebody, if they say, okay, I'll pay the $50 fine, I suspect they have no idea that they have pled guilty to the commission of a crime. And so I started discussing this with the town attorney, Municipal Association of South Carolina, with others, looking at other states and jurisdictions. My view, we can still, I think we should go forward with what we have here to provide some guidance and direction for enforcement of our current municipal code. But that we need to get to a place where we distinguish between a lot of our general offenses are things like shoplifting, public indecency, drunkenness, a whole host of things, which are properly under the misdemeanor category, and where you would issue a summons and you would confer jurisdiction upon the municipal court. But a lot of our ordinances are better described as civil infractions.
Yes.
And they should not involve the criminal court process in any way, shape, form, or fashion. And there's, so we could start the process of dividing. Should dog off leash or any of our beach management ordinances actually be crimes, or should they be civil infractions? There's a lot of things like that I think we should step back and take a look at, because I am extraordinarily uncomfortable that some of these matters, which are clearly not intended to be criminal conduct, become that.
So Mac, what do other people do? Other towns do?
They just ignore it. Or something like that. My personal opinion is I think
Where are you and the mayor going where you're running into naked drunk people all the time? I got to start going there too then.
You should read our beach management ordinance.
Mr. Warren, I wonder if he's...
He'll be here in a few minutes.
Sorry.
So you kind of pulled me in your rabbit hole a little bit too, because I was thinking about employment background checks, security clearances that a lot of people have.
Well,
that
that's
all
where it
this stuff
started talking. All of a
triggers
sudden,
that-
you're responding to form. Have
Yeah,
you
your
ever...
$50 turned into your job.
Yeah, and yes, it would be hard to, there would be kind of no easily identifiable criminal record, but one could certain FOIA that you had pled guilty to a violation of municipal ordinance in a criminal court.
The constant surveillance of the security clearance process right now.
this wouldn't be on like your SLED background report or like the National Crime Registry or anything like that. Like somebody to figure out that you got cited for walking a dog without a leash on kill would have to send in a FOIA request and do all that.
No, not necessarily. The security clearance constant surveillance process has analysts that are pulling this up every day from
But
municipalities.
part of the problem is, the problem is, how do you answer the request that says, have you ever been convicted of a criminal offense? Because you're caught between a rock and a hard place.
You're right about that. That's a good catch. But I've seen the data polls, and they've got AI tools that are pulling this out of municipalities every day.
So,
So if I wanted to go back to work and I walked a dog without a leash and they did a background check on me, they would find that
well, probably not.
If it's labeled as a criminal offense, they could.
well, that's why I was asking. How is it then labeled once you sign and I admit?
pled guilty.
I understand you plead, so then what happens then? I don't understand because I'm not familiar. What's the process? Where does it go?
It's recorded in a court, but the bigger issue is kind of what Mr. Spencer said is if you knowingly got a ticket for walking your dog and you said on your application, have you ever been convicted of a misdemeanor? And you said no, that's the bigger issue because now you've perjured yourself on your application.
And I can
I
really,
would have not have known it was a misdemeanor until today.
That's
and
what
I'm
we're
worried
talking
about that too because somebody's supervisor is going to get this flagged in an AI search, and they're going to get called into their office and say, you had a criminal offense this weekend.
Regardless of the exploration of this out in the universe in AI, it simply should not be the case that a lot of these municipal code requirements,
I agree.
they should be properly characterized as civil infractions, and there should be an administrative process for resolving those. And I would note that that is true with some municipal code violations. For example, zoning code violations, there's an administrative process. Business license issues, short-term rental licenses, there's an administrative process.
So how do we solve this?
So
I think we all are in agreement.
So we'll need to sit down. This is going to be one of these projects. We'll sit down with Mac and his firm. And what my thought is, and I've looked at a lot of stuff. North Carolina has been explicit. Most other states, South Carolina hasn't, have more proactively essentially decriminalized municipal code violations. But what we need to do is simply define the set of ordinance violations. Most of those which are listed under general offenses.
Define them as civil.
No, most of them that are listed under general offenses will continue to be criminal because those are public intoxication, indecency, shoplifting, theft of bicycles, defacing property, etc. All of those that are listed currently under general offense. Most of them, not all of them. For example, littering or debris cover. Those should be administrative processes. So we separate out those that would be, for which there would be an issuance of a uniform summons conferring jurisdiction upon the criminal court, and there should be a separate set of kind of everything else should be subject to an administrative process. We could still impose, I think you need to use the term penalty instead of fine. Clearly the town has the ability to, in a sense, enforce penalties if there are business license or zoning issues, because you have other enforcement tools, or you can revoke the license. But if there's a penalty for civil infraction and it's unpaid, then it becomes in the nature of a debt. And the town could actually send it out to collection or look to enforce it in small claims court or circuit court to the extent that that becomes necessary. But in those instances, people are simply paying the fine for a civil infraction. It doesn't involve any of this criminal court issues at all. Plus, it completely avoids this annoying issue with regard to the automatically added state assessment.
All right, so why don't we just do that? Just make it an administrative penalty then.
But we have to rewrite our ordinance to do that. Yes. We have to. It's going to be a not insignificant undertaking to do all that, but I think it's an important one. A path to go down. I agree. Wanted to let you know that, again, this was, and we're still trying to sift through all this. There's still some lack of clarity. My view is the way the statute is written is that just because you issue a notice of violation or uniform summons, that if somebody pays the fine, they should just have to be able to pay the fine if they're not contesting it and going to court, because the state assessment is supposed to involve essentially funding the court system. There are differences of view as to, some would say, you're pleading guilty the minute you issue the uniform summons. It became a court matter, whether it actually goes to court or not. You pled guilty to the crime, and therefore the state assessment has to automatically get applied, and therefore these face amount of tickets, that's where the parking ticket arose, which it should not have been. There's a separate issue, is that state assessment should never have been applied
Yeah,
to
thank you.
parking tickets. That was an error. But in any event, that's where that arose.
Thanks for looking
So
into
the
that.
uniform code ticket that they write, is that a standard form? Or is that something we can write?
They have what's called a uniform ordinance summons, and that is a specific statutory creature that has certain things that have to be on the actual ticket. In that statute, though, there's subsection G, which says this isn't the only means to enforce local ordinances. So you can create like a parking citation or other things.
The bottom line is we want to just be able to send out a notice of violation. And as all it is in violation that constitutes a civil infraction. And it's not the uniform ordinance summons, which we don't have to use. And so there will be you guys can certainly invite it to come up. It's gonna create some additional learning and challenges for the code enforcement, because they're gonna have to understand that there's two different types of citations.
Let me ask it another. So if one of our guys writes a uniform ordinance summons, can he or she or the mayor later waive that?
No.
It has to go to court once he writes it. Okay.
They can,
Can decide to,
Yeah, the prosecutor, judge,
but the council, the
So-
mayor, or we.
So food for thought. That's what I'm looking for. Food for thought is we could use the uniform ticket. I'm just thinking about kind of how to get this thing to work, and give them another sheet of paper that says, if you go to town hall and pay $12, the officer will tear this ticket up. And if they don't go to town hall, then they can be sent to court.
so I was kind of thinking along the same lines. I'm not quite sure it works, but I was originally thinking along the same lines. Why don't we simply say that here is your notice of violation. I don't even call it a ticket, a notice of violation. Here's a fine that could be paid. The fine is $50 and you can pay it. If you don't want to pay it, then you have the option of, we can issue you a uniform summons, ordinance summons, in which case you can go to court. But understand, if you go to court, if you're convicted, that fine is automatically going to more than double.
Yeah, I was thinking of a reverse, so that it gives them incentive to come settle it, and then if they don't settle it, then we've got a means where it just is forward and we don't have to go to collection agency.
Well,
the state takes care of it.
One thing we have to do still is what the court system provides is the due process. There has to be, if we're going to impose any type of penalty, whether it's revoking a license, imposing a fine or penalty, or any other activity, there has to be due process provided. So we do have administrative due process, BZA for zoning matters, planning commission. We do have an appeals process for short-term rentals. I'm not sure we really do for business. There is for business license. There is, well, and the council is actually the appeal body. Now, whether we want to be the appeal body for all these others, or we set up some review appeal board or an appeals officer, it could be just one person. There just needs to be some mechanism for.
That's what I'm thinking about.
The other thing about civil infractions is, in contrast to criminal, there are no evidentiary requirements. There are no rules of evidence. The burden is simply a preponderance of evidence, not guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a much more streamlined process.
Is the criminal version of this that we were talking about, is the only choice go to court or admit guilt? Is there a no contest option?
Well, they consider under the statute, nolo contendere is considered to be an admission of guilt and effectively a guilty plea.
Okay. Thanks.
Do you have a recommendation, Mac, or? It's a long process.
I don't want to say it's going to be a short process, but I do think looking into the issue more legally, but also seeing if any other municipalities locally, like City of Charleston, obviously they're bigger. Let's see what they do. Let's see if they've got a specific category for, civil infractions or that sort of thing. And then I've reached out to Eric Scheidel. I think I'm talking with him later this week, just on his
I would say
ideas
he
and
and I were
thoughts
supposed
too.
to touch base this morning, and we were not able to do so. I did talk to Desiree, who, is former IOP town administrator, is now working with Eric. And it's kind of, okay, we need to think about this. But regardless, I want us to be at the vanguard because this appears to be that South Carolina municipalities, for some reason, have just gone down this path that is just not in the public interest. And again, when I start looking, North Carolina, California, a host of others, they all have this kind of civil infraction or different ways to enforce municipal ordinance. Again, you need to divide between those that everybody would agree constitutes a crime.
Yep.
Maybe just a Class C misdemeanor, maybe a Class A or B, versus stuff that, guys, yes, you shouldn't be doing this, and we're going to ding you $50 if you don't stop doing it, but that's kind of the end of it.
Well, somebody must have gone down this road before, so let's before we spend a lot of effort,
Yeah, I was gonna
ask
say,
some questions.
I had pulled a couple ordinances. I worked in probably 4 municipalities before here, and fortunately, we have handled it the same way that we're handling it. But the one difference that we can look at is City of Spartanburg, City of Greenville, and I thought it was City of Charleston, but I know Greenville, when I was in Spartanburg as well, we had what's called livability court, and then you had criminal court. So it could be that, and I just don't remember because when I was in Spartanburg, we didn't write our own tickets. We had code enforcement, and we gave it all to code enforcement, and they did everything for us. There would be times that they would go to livability court and times they would go to criminal court. So it could have been that we did kind of separate out, and we called it livability court, even though it wasn't maybe treated the same as a criminal court. So I think we can look at maybe if there's some other ways.
But at least in the city of Charleston, livability court is still a criminal court.
Yeah, as I said, I think in Charleston, I'm not sure if it was that, I think in Greenville's that way, but I don't remember if it's Spartanburg. But we'll look and see because we may be able to.
My guess is that unfortunately, this is something that people just haven't dealt with or thought about in South Carolina before. They've gone down this path that just kind of everybody uses uniform summons, ordinance summons, and doesn't look at that language, subparagraph G, that says you can basically enforce your ordinances however you want to. The issue has always been, and when I talked to Desiree, she mentioned IOP, they actually, for example, had an ordinance, no smoking on the beach. But the issue is they were trying to do it as a civil infraction. There was no enforcement mechanism, but in fact there is, because again, it becomes the nature of a debt, something owed to the town that you could send collections out to get.
I like that.
So, yes, yeah. Yes, yeah.
Continue, and I can provide. I looked at Hilton Heads, and so we can look at some other. But I think here in South Carolina, for the most part, municipalities, we're probably doing it all the same way. Not saying it's the right way, but probably all the same way.
I represent or have dealt with do it the exact same way. I see the issue.
I'm just not.
I've got an example I'll give you afterwards.
Not comfortable. Rob or Saz, I mean, do you guys have some comments? Do you want to offer any comments on the code enforcement policies and procedures that will still guide us until such time as? Because I know we've had this conversation. There's always this issue of how much discretion to be accorded, and there's good things about discretion. There's problematic things about discretion.
Sure. I think our end goal is compliance. So at the end of the day, that's what we're looking for. And I think we can obviously use the lowest level of enforcement means necessary. Generally, a verbal warning is sufficient, and education is mostly what it takes.
But do you see any, I mean, what we've tried to do here is obviously compliance is the goal. Verbal is where you start. You hopefully, with all of these, the idea is let's not bother involving the court system, but there is a progressive set of fines here.
Sure, and I think I understand exactly where you're coming from and exactly where you're going. I think for us on the enforcement side, there's a lot of stuff there's a lot of rules on the island, and for us to be able to effectively enforce things, being able to articulate to somebody that this is a town violation and it carries heavier weight. You have the option of either paying the fine or appearing in court and pleading your case before the judge, as opposed to a Kika type approach, for example, where there isn't that sort of level of maybe understanding of the seriousness of a violation as an administrative thing on the civil side versus having a like some extra teeth as the town. So I think a careful look through the ordinances to see what's appropriate and what's not to kind of fall back. But stuff like the leash law, I mean, I agree. I don't think that somebody should not have security clearances because they didn't have their dog on the leash. That said, that's probably the most problematic thing that we deal with, and having some teeth behind it is very helpful.
And we should figure out some way to make sure that we do have teeth behind that, because that is the most prevalent. But again, my mind is just different than somebody, public indecency or shoplifting or something like that. It's
Sure.
It's just a different, fundamentally different character.
Yeah, and I think,
Okay. So, but we'd certainly, as we because you guys are, the tip of the spear on this stuff, into the day, you guys are the ones that are having the conversations. From my standpoint, I think a verbal discussion and verbal warnings, if it would always be preferred, and to the extent that that's successful, hallelujah. And I do appreciate that there is an issue sometimes of greater weight or gravity to the, being potentially hauled into court versus Kika's enforcement or lack thereof. And in fact, they can actually only impose fines against members,
Right.
Not visitors. Not short-term rental guests, et cetera. So I do appreciate it. Now, whether being hauled into court or, is the appropriate weight of the hammer or whatever is I think a legitimate question.
Do you have any issues with dog leash people because they don't have an identification and the dog doesn't have identification? Is that
I think that's our struggle on the beach in general. People aren't carrying IDs in their bikini or their bathing suit. And,
so would it help if, okay, I wear a bikini, a thong when I'm on the beach, so.
I wish you could unsay that.
You guys all have that visual? You have the visual?
I wish you could unsay that.
We have talked about having dog licenses, both for residents and then for visitors. Would that give you a way to identify at least the dog and ultimately then the owner, and then you could see the dog has a collar, and does that help you?
We've talked about that in the past. I don't see there being an advantage there for us enforcement wise. Usually if somebody's not compliant with giving us their information, we usually follow them back to their car, get their license tag, or follow them back to their house, get their address, get sheriff's office to help us get their information and mail them a ticket. So.
That takes some time from you doing other things, right?
Sure, but so does the administrative piece of trying to find all the dogs that are coming in to visit the island.
I guess take it maybe one step further. I mean, if you had, it's like a certain color a collar that represented, you registered and you have to have a certain color collar to be on the beach. One it may be resident, one may be visitor, and if there is you don't see this at all, they're not permitted to be on the beach, full stop.
Well, that was a discussion we had before. If you were a resident, you would get a collar with a certain color, and we would then be able to identify readily who are the troublemakers, if you will. And because I don't think it's the residents, it's the guest dogs. Without collars, you can see
Well, they wouldn't be allowed on the beach at all. That's the whole point.
Yeah, we'll try enforcing that though, but.
Well, that's
But then
pretty
the same
easy
thing,
if
you're
you
back to
know
following
that
back to
they are not permitted to be on the beach. That's a,
I mean, that would be an easy thing to enforce. I think that would be an administrative nightmare to implement, but, I mean,
yeah, I mean,
enforcement-wise, we can enforce that if you
Yeah.
want us to.
I've got a different question track, if I can jump tracks. So short-term rental violations, I think that the person who would get cited would be the owner, right, not the rental company? Is that the intent?
Either or.
Either or. Well, that kind of feeds into my next question, loose material, debris management. Are those imposed on the job site, on the homeowner, on the company? Because you can get to 3 violations quickly, which is fine if that's our intent. Is it site by site? Is it rental by rental? Or is it by company? Or
For the loose materials ordinance?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, as we're doing the cumulative, first, second, third offense.
I'm not sure that the loose materials ordinance was tied directly to the STR license.
no, it's not.
It's just, it's 2 categories, but it's the same idea of, do we intend to do it at a micro level of the owner of the property that's getting the construction done? Are we intending to do it site by site? Or are we
We do it by the
intending to do
contractor.
it at the enterprise level?
There are slightly different ways to kind of think about that. It's primarily the offending party. So with loose materials or job construction site, it's not the homeowner that is,
That's what I'm
causing the
getting
offense. It's the contractor or subcontractor that is, with short-term rentals, it gets a little bit more complicated because there are conditions of the license. So you are violating, there may be an individual violating an ordinance, but you may also be violating the terms of the conditions of the license, and license may be held by both the property management company and the individual property owner.
And I'm just trying to think this through, like, a construction company that's working on 15 sites on Kiowa could get 3 offenses in a day. So, and maybe that's what we're trying to police.
Well, so that's where, when we start down the civil path, what I'm thinking is that the hammer, if we can pose the fines, they may consider that just a cost of doing business if the fines aren't that much, but you could then say certain number of offenses. Pull the license. So for a contractor, all of a sudden, they're gonna, I would think, they would shape up pretty quickly.
And the only reason I'm thinking about that is if they've got 15 sites and 4 of the sites get cited in one night, are we accomplishing what we're going to do with first, second, third escalation, give them a chance to self-correct before we're throwing the monkey wrench at them?
But again, what we would have under civil process, but we could come up with, repeated violations of these above offenses may result in the revocation of a license for a license holder.
I'm asking something different, though. I'm saying you go from 0 to revocation a day, potentially, if you've got a large number of job sites.
So
And I
right
think we're
now,
trying to do escalation based off a chance, okay, here's your first one. Try not to get the second, try not to get third.
No, there would be some discretion in this process. There would be a revocation would be its own.
I'm just asking how fast we want it to ratchet up on them, that's all.
So
Because it
the
could happen
3
in one-
offenses only is attached to STRs
Yeah,
right
it's
now.
only attached to
So-
STRs.
So that would be something new.
Yeah,
I
and
guess that
even
would be-
there, it's problematic because you can't, you could arguably cite for the same kind of contact, it may, we've discussed in another context, but if you have one bad apple of a renter, and they could have kind of multiple violations within a week, or even within a course of a day or two, should that lead to the revocation of the license?
Well, we're covering dumpsters, if 3 dumpsters out of 15 are in a day, you're up at $950 in fines and in a day. Is that what we're intending? That's all I'm trying to ask.
No.
Yeah.
Does it 3 times?
3 times, do we,
Those are separate commercial vehicles. I mean, I think each one gets a,
I'm looking at dumpsters on construction
oh,
sites.
dumpsters.
As an example.
The last one that I put is for anything.
That's going to be some interpretive matter, because you're not necessarily going to know that it's the same contractor or not. At least in my view, if I were talking to code enforcement staff about how to interpret that, it's a dumpster at a site. You give it the first, you've had a verbal warning, first citation, and that covers $150. At that site, if it continues, the next one's $250.
That's why I'm asking site versus contractor, because we know by the permit who the contractor is, so.
I suggest we
but-
let Brad,
yeah.
I suggest we let Matt come back. We're like talking over beers. We're just,
Well, no, what Max talk has nothing to do with this. This is what we're planning to implement within our current existing framework. What we're then talking about is completely separate from that, coming back and trying to identify a different enforcement regime for those things which should not be deemed, which we would not want to deem criminal misconduct.
Yeah, I'm just asking what's written in the proposed policy. I said I didn't want to jump tracks.
I understand. That's what, but I was trying to explain at least how I would, as a matter, we're the ones enforcing this. So there's some interpretive guidance. It's not to.
And it's policy, not code.
The
but-
bottom line, if you're simply the code enforcement officer, particularly, I don't know, you guys, you're on site. You just simply see the subcontractor, he's right there, or the contractor. Uncovered or litter. Here is the summons. You just give it to them. I don't know if you've gone through the process of figuring out whether who the general is, who the permit holder is at that point in time, and compared to whether or not you guys have yet or will later that same day give citations for litter or uncovered dumpsters elsewhere. I don't see them being linked.
Okay, I'm just presenting the scenario that we ought to think about, that's all.
But again, it does get to the point where we would want to be able to, in those instances, if they're just not responding to monetary penalties.
this is getting so administrative. Let's get to a conclusion.
I mean, this is the administrative policy here, so, just so, anyway. There is nothing to, I mean, this was just for discussion. If you guys had any good questions about this, were good questions, because we've got to work through this. But I just wanted to alert you to where we're going to be going after.
I understood.
Okay. Any other?
Just one quick one. We've got the progressive enforcement approach up front, page 1, verbal, written, and then citations. But then when you go to like page 4 or 3, sorry, you have loose materials. The first violation is $250. So do they get verbal and written, or do you just dump, is this a different category because it's loose materials or short-term rental violations or whatever?
Well, all of these, I think, are verbal. You start with verbal, but the question is if you're actually going beyond verbal, what's the progression?
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
This is a good start, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Where are we on? I don't even have my, I don't even know what I did. Oh, yes, well, now we are citizen comments. Yes, sir.
Oh.
Yes.
We need to buy him dinner for staying this long.
Mr. DeStefano.
He said he'd
One of the
leave if it
things I
got
should
boring.
have brought up before, but with respect to your comments about the 3 levels you have to go through, and the ARB is in there. The reason I think what you want to do is appropriate. The ARB doesn't have to give anybody any notice of any appeal that comes to them. In our discussions with the ARB task force, one of the things I brought up, and it was kind of consensually agreed to, is when somebody comes to the ARB, when we eventually get it, if they want a variance of some type, similar to the 200 feet or 500 feet that town has, because the house across the street from me got a variance from the ARB and also applied for a zoning variance. Well, the zoning variance was fine. They were here, it was approved, nobody knew anything about the ARB approval. So if the ARB approves an ugly fence, you're not going to know about it until it goes up. So there's got to be some way, hopefully in the future, the ARB will have a process of notification of neighbors. But right now, they can do whatever they want. They don't have to tell anybody.
Well, if it resided within the HOA, which is where 99% of architectural control boards do reside, is within the HOAs,
Right.
then you would have all the protector procedures, procedural protections, and kind of due process built into the rules and regulations and the charter, the bylaws of that
If it's
organization.
under the HOA, which is the goal. Secondly, with respect to this 10 to 15-foot buffer, if an existing property owner has a 10-foot buffer and there's something in the next 5 feet, what happens? That's, closing the door after the dog is out. Are you going to be able to force them?
So what are you talking about within the, because
Well,
remember.
right now, there's a 10-foot buffer.
No, but that's only, that's the buffer, but the setback is further than
Right.
that.
But, and then you got a setback, but there might be something like, somebody might have a bench there. Somebody might have a potted plant there in that 5 feet. Okay? If it's allowed now and you change that 5 feet, that's an issue. It's an issue that's going to come up.
Yeah.
So whether and to go into the process of grandfathering people in, you'd have to do a survey of the entire island, that's.
So we talked about that. What if you have just sod? Does that mean you have to stop cutting the grass for that 5 feet?
Exactly.
That
So
type of thing, yeah.
it's that type of thing. So, and that's probably, when you say just about everybody is violating, I'm guaranteeing you almost everybody is going to have that 5-foot problem. So I have to be careful there. The other thing,
I suspect if they're in that 5 foot, they're also in the 10 foot.
the other thing, criminal versus civil, this was public knowledge, but a former, shall I say, Kika board member had a civil fraud Securities Exchange Commission judgment against him for $1.5 billion, but it wasn't a criminal offense. And the company paid it anyway, so it got paid, but it was just, talking about a leash law being a crime. Well, the $1.5 billion wasn't a crime. It's the whole opposite of that. That was, just wanted to mention that for nothing.
Thank you for that. Any other citizen comments? Council member comments?
Thank you.
I just want to say thank you, because you guys put up with a lot of my stuff today. Again, a lot of it is from personal experience. And so I feel like I know a little bit about some of these things, but I want to thank you all for bearing with me, especially you, Mr. Mayor, for this long and drag-out discussion on a couple different points. So thank you.
Well, and I only want to say as well, thank you to all of you for always a thoughtful discussion of sometimes complex issues. And I think the community is better for it. We are adjourned.